Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we step into the shadows with Edward Cullen, the century-old vampire who believed he understood loneliness until he met the one mind he could never read. This is the story we never fully saw. The truth hidden behind bronze hair and golden eyes. The desperate obsession masked as protective love. The darkness that consumed him long before Bella Swan walked into that biology classroom. So, before you get cozy, I want to tell you something small and honest. I have this dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the month ends. If you've been enjoying these stories and you'd like to help me get there, subscribing would mean so much. Now, let us ease into Edward's hidden existence and let his century of waiting carry you gently into rest. Chicago in 1917 was a city transforming itself through industry and ambition. The stockyards and steel mills creating wealth that built mansions along the lakeshore while immigrant families crowded into tenements on the south side. The whole metropolis humming with that peculiar American optimism that believed progress was inevitable and prosperity was the natural reward for hard work and moral living. The Great War raged in Europe but felt distant to most Americans despite the propaganda posters and the Liberty Bond drives. The fighting still someone else's problem. Even as young men began shipping overseas to trenches that would swallow an entire generation. It was a world balanced between Victorian propriety and modern recklessness, between the old certainties of the 19th century and the coming chaos of the 20th. A world that would be shattered completely by the pandemic, that was already spreading silently through military camps and port cities, waiting to explode into the deadliest plague in human history. Edward Anthony Mason was born on June 20th, 1891, to Edward Sr. and Elizabeth Mason, a family of comfortable upper-middle-class means, whose wealth came from Edward Sr.'s legal practice, serving Chicago's industrial titans and real estate developers. The Marson home on the north side was filled with books and music and the kind of cultured conversation that marked families who valued education and artistic refinement, Elizabeth in particular insisting that her only son receive piano instruction from the age of 5 and that he be exposed to literature and poetry and all the markers of civilized society. Edward grew up knowing he was loved and expected to achieve. His mother's ambitions for him running toward law or medicine or perhaps academia, something respectable and intellectually demanding that would allow him to make his mark on the world in ways that mattered beyond simple accumulation of wealth. He was musical from early childhood, his talent at the piano progressing beyond mere competence into something approaching genuine artistry by the time he reached adolescence. His ability to sight-read complex compositions and to interpret pieces with emotional depth that seemed remarkable for someone so young, suggesting he had inherited his mother's sensitivity and her capacity for feeling things deeply. His father was proud, but somewhat baffled by this artistic temperament, Edward Sr. being a practical man whose world was contracts and property law and the concrete realities of business, rather than the abstract beauties of Chopin nocturnes or Beethoven sonatas. But Elizabeth encouraged the music relentlessly, understanding that her son possessed something precious and rare, a genuine gift that deserved cultivation regardless of whether it would ever translate into professional success or financial security. School came easily to Edward, his intelligence evident in his quick grasp of languages and mathematics and history, his reading advancing years beyond his age group, his essays praised by teachers who recognized unusual sophistication in his thinking and his expression. He was popular enough without being part of the most social circles, his interests in music and books marking him as somewhat serious and intellectual, but not so removed from normal boyish pursuits that he was isolated or mocked. He played tennis and swam at the club where his family held membership, participated in debate society at school, attended the expected social functions where young people of his class gathered under careful adult supervision to practice the rituals of courtship that would eventually lead to appropriate marriages and the continuation of their social stratum. The summer of 1918 began with oppressive heat and humidity that made Chicago feel like it was suffocating under a wet blanket. The lake breeze offering minimal relief from temperatures that climbed into the 90s day after day. The whole city slowing down and becoming irritable in the sweltering weather. Edward had graduated from high school that spring and was preparing to enter the University of Chicago in the fall to study law as his father wished, though he harbored private dreams of perhaps studying music instead, of maybe even going to Europe after the war ended to study with the great pianists and composers whose work he admired, with an intensity that felt almost religious in his devotion. He spent his days reading and playing piano and occasionally meeting friends for tennis or swimming. The lazy golden summer of a young man on the threshold of adulthood, full of possibility and promise, and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having experienced real loss or tragedy or any serious challenge to his comfortable existence. The influenza arrived in Chicago in late August, reports filtering in from the East Coast about an unusually deadly flu that was killing people within hours or days of their first symptoms. The stories alarming, but still feeling somewhat abstract and distant. The way news of disasters in other places always felt remote from one's own immediate reality. The papers reported deaths in Boston and Philadelphia and New York, the numbers climbing with each edition, but Chicago felt safe initially, the distance and the late summer heat creating an illusion that perhaps the city would be spared whatever was ravaging the eastern seaboard. Edward Sr. dismissed the reports as probably exaggerated, newspapers being sensationalist by nature and always looking for dramatic stories that would sell more copies. His practical lawyer's mind skeptical of claims that seemed designed more to generate fear than to convey actual useful information. But then people began dying in Chicago. First, a few cases scattered across different neighborhoods, then dozens, then hundreds, as September progressed into the cooler weather of early autumn. The hospitals overflowed within days, patients lying on cots in the hallways and converted spaces because there was no room in the actual wards. Doctors and nurses working until they collapsed from exhaustion, only to wake and return to work, because there was no one else to care for the endless stream of sick and dying. The city shut down schools and theatres and churches, banned public gatherings, required masks be worn in public spaces, the whole metropolis grinding to a frightened halt as the death toll climbed into the thousands and then tens of thousands across the country, the pandemic revealing itself to be worse than anyone had initially imagined or feared. Edward Sr. fell ill first in mid-September, the fever and body aches and terrible cough coming on with shocking speed, his robust health collapsing in less than a day into delirium and weakness that left him unable to leave his bed. Elizabeth nursed him with desperate determination, her belief that good care and a positive attitude could overcome illness running headlong into a virus that did not care about her faith or her efforts or her love for her husband. Edward tried to help his mother care for his father, fetching water and changing sheets, and doing whatever small tasks might ease his father's suffering. His fear growing as Edward Sr.'s condition worsened rather than improved despite their best efforts, and despite the brief visits from their doctor, who could offer little beyond advice to keep the patient comfortable and wait for the fever to break. Edward himself fell ill 3 days after his father. The same rapid onset of symptoms that began with what felt like a normal cold and escalated within hours into the kind of sickness that made breathing feel like work, and that turned his body into something he could not control or command. He was aware of his mother's presence in his room, her cool hands on his forehead, her voice reading to him or praying or simply talking to him about anything and everything in an effort to keep him connected to consciousness and to life. He heard his father die in the next room, the terrible, rattling breathing stopping suddenly, the silence that followed somehow worse than the sounds of suffering had been. His mother's broken sobbing as she sat with her husband's body before returning to Edward's bedside with renewed desperation to save her son, since she had failed to save her husband. Elizabeth fell ill herself shortly after Edward Sr.'s death. Her exhaustion and her constant exposure to the virus finally overwhelming whatever resistance she had maintained through sheer force of will and maternal determination. She and Edward were sick together in their separate rooms, the house silent except for their laboured breathing and occasional coughing, no servants remaining because the staff had either fled the city or fallen ill themselves, the whole world contracting to just the two of them dying slowly in rooms that had once been filled with music and conversation and life. Edward was dimly aware of being moved at some point, strong arms lifting him, voices he did not recognize discussing arrangements in tones that suggested decisions were being made about his care or his disposal or perhaps his burial. The hospital where he woke briefly was a vision of hell. Bodies everywhere, the living and the dead sometimes hard to distinguish in the dim lighting and the chaos of overwhelmed staff, trying to provide care to far more patients than any facility could reasonably accommodate. He saw his mother in a bed near his own, her face grey and her breathing shallow, her eyes opening occasionally to look at him with an expression that mixed love with grief and desperate hope. A doctor appeared periodically, a young man with pale skin and golden eyes, who seemed less frazzled than the other medical staff, who moved through the dying with calm efficiency and particular attention to Elizabeth and to Edward himself. Elizabeth spoke to the doctor during one of his visits, her voice barely audible, but her intention clear even through Edward's fever-clouded consciousness, her request that if he could save only one of them, he should save her son, that Edward had his whole life ahead of him, while she had already lived her years and was ready to go be with her husband, if that was God's will. She begged the doctor to do everything possible for Edward, to not let her boy die, to save him by any means available, even if conventional medicine had failed. The doctor, Carlisle Cullen, though Edward would not learn his name until later, listened to Elizabeth's pleas with an expression that suggested he understood she was asking for something far beyond normal medical intervention, that she somehow sensed or knew or had been told that this particular doctor had capabilities that went beyond what his credentials and training would suggest. Edward died as a human on September 20th, 1918. His heart stopping after days of struggling to sustain a body ravaged by virus and secondary infections, and the general collapse of systems too damaged to continue functioning. He died believing he had lived 17 years, and that whatever came after death would reveal itself in due time. His last human thoughts fragmented and confused, some part of him aware of his mother's presence nearby, and some part of him reaching for his father, who had already gone ahead into whatever darkness or light awaited them all. He woke 3 days later to a world transformed beyond recognition, his senses overwhelmed by input they had never been designed to process at such intensity, every sound magnified into cacophony, and every scent separated into its component parts, and every visual detail sharp enough to hurt. Carlisle was there explaining things in a calm, steady voice, telling Edward about vampires and transformation and the venom that had rewritten his cells and rebuilt him into something that looked human, but was fundamentally other, something that would never age or sicken or die again, but that would also never be truly human again, no matter how carefully he pretended or how perfectly he imitated the living. Edward's first impulse was to reject this impossible explanation, to insist that Carlisle was lying, or that Edward himself was experiencing some elaborate fever dream. But the evidence was undeniable in the strength of his hands and the clarity of his vision and the complete absence of heartbeat in his chest, where his pulse should have been marking time. The hunger came next, burning through him with an intensity that made his previous human hunger feel like mild preferences rather than actual needs. His throat raw with craving for something Carlisle explained was blood, human blood specifically, though Carlisle himself had learned to survive on animal blood, and hoped Edward might choose the same path, despite the difficulty and the constant temptation to take easier prey. Edward's horror at this revelation was profound and immediate, understanding that he had become the monster from stories, the predator that hunted humans in darkness, the creature that should be destroyed rather than preserved. Carlisle spoke about choice and about the possibility of living without killing humans, about creating meaning and purpose even in this cursed existence, about family and community and the future they could build together if Edward was willing to try. The 1920s became Edward's decade of rebellion and darkness, his rejection of Carlisle's optimistic philosophy in favor of what seemed like more honest acknowledgement of what he was and what he was capable of becoming. He left Carlisle in 1927, unable to maintain the pretense that he was anything other than predator, unwilling to continue the charade of living among humans and pretending to be civilized when every moment required suppressing urges that felt fundamental to his new nature. He hunted criminals exclusively, reading their minds to determine guilt before taking them as prey, convincing himself that this selective hunting was morally superior to either hunting innocence or suffering through the inadequate sustenance of animal blood that left him always slightly hungry and always aware of what he was denying himself. He became intimately familiar with the darkness of human thought during those years, reading the minds of murderers and rapists and abusers, understanding the depths of cruelty humans were capable of inflicting on each other, the violence and selfishness and casual evil that lurk beneath the surface of civilized society. He read their justifications and their pleasure in causing suffering, their memories of victims and their plans for future atrocities, using their own thoughts as judge and jury before executing them and draining them and leaving their bodies in alleys or rivers or abandoned buildings where they would be found eventually and attributed to gang violence or mysterious circumstances. He told himself he was providing justice, removing dangerous people from the world, performing a service that human law enforcement could not accomplish, because they lacked his particular ability to know with certainty who deserved to die. But the darkness consumed him rather than satisfying him, each kill reinforcing his conviction that he was monster rather than hero, that his rationalizations were just elaborate justifications for indulging his predatory nature, that he was no better than the criminals he hunted because he too was taking lives and taking pleasure in the hunt and the kill, even if he told himself his motivations were purer than simple bloodlust. The minds he read left stains on his own consciousness, their memories becoming his memories, their victims suffering witness secondhand through the thoughts of those who had inflicted it, the accumulated weight of human evil and his own participation in the cycle of violence, eventually breaking through his justifications and leaving him hollow and self-loathing and desperate for something different, even if he could not articulate what that something might be. He returned to Carlisle in 1931, defeated and ashamed, his experiment in independent existence having proven only that he lacked the strength or the wisdom, or perhaps simply the hope to build any kind of meaningful existence alone. Carlisle welcomed him back without judgment or recrimination, his father figure's capacity for forgiveness and faith in Edward's better nature somehow surviving despite Edward's betrayal of everything Carlisle had tried to teach him. They talked for days about what Edward had experienced and what he had learned, Carlisle listening to Edward's descriptions of the criminals' minds and the justice Edward had believed he was dispensing, gently pointing out the arrogance in appointing himself executioner and the corruption inherent in taking pleasure from killing, regardless of the victim's supposed guilt. Edward rejoined the family that Carlisle had been building, meeting Esme, who had been transformed in Edward's absence and who brought maternal warmth to their small coven. Her gentleness and her capacity for love despite her own tragic history, providing a model for how one might survive this existence without becoming entirely monstrous. Rosalie joined them in 1933, her beauty and her bitterness both profound, her transformation having been forced rather than chosen, her resentment at being denied human life and human death, creating a kinship with Edward's own complicated feelings about immortality and damnation. Emmett followed in 1935 after Rosalie found him being mauled by a bear and begged Carlyle to save him. The big man's easy nature and his enthusiastic embrace of vampire existence providing contrast to Edward and Rosalie's brooding. Alice and Jasper appeared in 1950, already together. Alice's visions having shown her the Cullens and her place with them long before they actually met. Jasper's experience in the Southern Vampire Wars making him dangerous and damaged, but also deeply committed to the peaceful existence Carlyle offered as alternative to the violence that had defined his previous decades. Edward watched his siblings pair off into couples over the years. Rosalie and Emmett finding in each other something that completed them both. Alice and Jasper's connection evident in their constant physical proximity and their seamless coordination. The four of them creating partnerships that seemed to ease the burden of immortality through shared existence and mutual devotion. Edward remained alone, convincing himself that his isolation was preference rather than simply failure to find someone who could tolerate his intensity and his darkness and his tendency towards self-loathing that made him exhausting companion, even for those who loved him. He told himself he did not want the kind of relationship his siblings had found, that he was content with his music and his books and his role as the family's resident intellectual and protector. That romantic love was human weakness he had transcended through his transformation into something beyond human emotional needs. But he watched Emmett and Rosalie with envy he tried to hide, watched Alice and Jasper with longing he refused to acknowledge, understood on some level that he was lying to himself, but could not seem to overcome whatever internal barrier prevented him from seeking or accepting the kind of connection his siblings had found. The decades blurred together in the way time did for immortals. The years distinguished mainly by changes in fashion and technology, rather than by any significant personal development or emotional growth. Edward's existence settling into comfortable numbness, punctuated by occasional relocations when the family needed to move before people noticed they were not aging. He perfected the role of perpetual student, attending high school and college repeatedly, learning new subjects and maintaining old knowledge, his mind expanding even as his emotional life remained stunted, and his social existence remained performance rather than genuine connection. He played piano because it was something to do with his hands, and because muscle memory from his human life still responded to the instrument, even when he felt nothing particular while playing. The music technically perfect but emotionally empty in ways that would have horrified his mother Elizabeth, who had valued feeling over precision. Carlyle spoke to Edward occasionally about hope and faith, and the possibility that Edward's mate existed somewhere, that patience and time would eventually reveal the person meant to complete him, the way Esme completed Carlyle, and the way Edward's siblings had found their matches. Edward listened politely and dismissed these reassurances as Carlyle's optimistic nature, refusing to accept that some vampires were simply meant to be alone, that Edward's particular combination of abilities and temperament made him unsuitable for the kind of partnership that required vulnerability and trust, and the capacity to believe in goodness despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. He had read too many minds, seen too much human darkness, accumulated too much cynicism and self-hatred to believe he deserved love or could sustain relationship with someone who truly knew him. The move to Forks in 2003 was just another relocation in an endless series of moves. The small town on the Olympic Peninsula, notable mainly for its persistent cloud cover that allowed them to attend school during daylight hours without the constant worry about unexpected sunshine revealing their sparkling skin. Edward had been to Forks before in the 1930s. The town barely changed in the intervening 70 years. The same endless rain and oppressive forest and claustrophobic small-town atmosphere where everyone knew everyone and newcomers were noticed and discussed and eventually absorbed into the community or rejected as too different to integrate. He enrolled at Forks High School for what felt like the 1,000th time, prepared for another 2 or 3 years of pretending to be 17. Another cycle of tedious classes covering material he had mastered decades ago. Another performance of normal human teenager that had become so routine he could maintain it without conscious effort. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Edward's existence having contracted to small familiar patterns that required no thought and generated no particular emotion beyond mild boredom and the constant low-level awareness that he was monster pretending to be boy, predator pretending to be student, damned creature pretending to have future worth planning for. He sat in classes and read his teachers' minds and his classmates' minds, their thoughts providing entertainment that the actual lessons could not match. The drama of teenage social dynamics and romantic entanglements and academic anxieties playing out in hundreds of individual consciousnesses that Edward observed like someone watching television shows he had seen too many times to find genuinely engaging. He hunted with his family in the forest, taking elk and mountain lion and bear, the animal blood sustaining him adequately if not satisfyingly, his existence maintained but not truly lived in any meaningful sense. He had no expectation that anything would change, or that Forks would be different from any other small town where they had performed this same charade. No anticipation that his endless existence was about to be interrupted by a girl whose mind he could not read and whose blood would sing to him more powerfully than anything he had encountered in his 90 years as vampire. He was prepared for more of the same. More decades of comfortable numbness, more centuries of existing without truly living. His conviction that he was beyond redemption and unworthy of happiness so deeply embedded that he could not have imagined the transformation that awaited him when Isabella Swan walked into his biology class and shattered his carefully maintained isolation with her silence and her scent and her complete disregard for his monstrous nature. The morning of January 18th, 2005 began like every other morning in Edward's endless existence, with him pretending to sleep in his room at the Cullen house before rising to prepare for another day of high school theatre, where he would play the role of normal teenage boy, attending classes that bored him and socializing with classmates whose every thought he could hear whether he wanted to or not. Alice had been having visions all morning, her precognitive gift showing her fragments of something significant approaching but nothing clear enough to interpret with certainty. Just flashes of a girl with brown hair and a sense that today would matter in ways Alice could not yet articulate or explain. Edward dismissed her vague warnings as he often did, Alice's visions being useful for avoiding genuine danger, but often cryptic when dealing with smaller personal matters. Her insistence that he pay attention to days seeming like typical Alice dramatics rather than legitimate cause for concern. The drive to school was quiet. Rosalie's thoughts full of her usual resentment at having to attend high school again. Emmett's thoughts cheerfully focused on the prank he was planning to play on Mike Newton during lunch. Jasper's thoughts carefully controlled as always to avoid broadcasting the anxiety he felt being surrounded by so many humans in the confined space of a school building. Alice's thoughts still fragmentary and concerned about whatever her visions were showing her. Edward drove his Volvo with unnecessary precision, his movements perfect because vampire reflexes made human tasks absurdly easy. His mind wandering through the thoughts of students arriving in the parking lot, reading their excitement about the new student who would be starting today. The gossip spreading through the school's collective consciousness before the girl herself had even arrived. Isabella Swan was the subject of intense speculation and interest. Edward learning through the minds around him that she was Chief Swan's daughter from Arizona, that she had moved to Forks to live with her father for reasons that varied depending on which student's thoughts he was reading, that she represented novelty in a school where everyone had known everyone else since elementary school, and new students were rare enough to generate genuine excitement rather than simple curiosity. Edward paid minimal attention to this chatter, new students appearing occasionally and always being less interesting than the initial gossip suggested, their thoughts proving as mundane and predictable as everyone else's. Once the novelty wore off, and they settled into the school's established social hierarchies and routines, biology class 4th period began routinely, Edward taking his usual seat at the blacktop lab table that had remained partnerless for the past year since his previous lab partner had graduated. His preference for working alone generally respected by Mr. Banner, who seemed to sense that Edward performed better without the distraction of trying to collaborate with students whose understanding of cellular biology was rudimentary at best. The classroom filled with the usual thoughts, students discussing weekend plans and complaining about the assignment due next week, and speculating about whether Mr. Banner would actually follow through on his threat to give a pop quiz. The white noise of teenage consciousness that Edward had learned to filter into background static that required no active attention or engagement. And then the door opened and the scent hit him with physical force that made his body go rigid and his vision narrow, and every instinct he possessed scream at him to attack, to kill, to feed on the source of the most appealing blood he had encountered in 90 years of existence as predator. Isabella Swan stood in the doorway, holding her schedule slip, her brown hair slightly damp from the rain, her expression nervous as Mr. Banner checked her paperwork and directed her to the only empty seat in the classroom, which was of course beside Edward at the lab table designed for 2 students. Edward's hand came up to cover his nose and mouth in automatic defensive gesture, trying futilely to block the scent that was already overwhelming his control and making his throat burn with venom and thirst that demanded immediate satisfaction regardless of consequences or witnesses or his 90 years of practiced restraint. His mind raced through possibilities and strategies, calculating how quickly he could kill everyone in the classroom to eliminate witnesses before taking the girl whose blood called to him more powerfully than anything he had experienced or imagined possible. Understanding that he could snap every neck in the room within seconds, that the teacher and the students would be dead before they understood what was happening, that nothing could stop him if he chose to indulge the monster currently demanding he feed. He read Mr. Banner's thoughts, the teacher noticing nothing unusual about Edward's posture or expression, his attention already returning to the lesson plan he was reviewing. He read Jessica Stanley's thoughts, the girl beside him noticing that Edward seemed tense, but attributing it to general antisocial tendency rather than murderous intent. He read Mike Newton's thoughts, the boy watching Isabella Swan with instant attraction and sexual interest that made Edward want to kill him for entirely different reasons than simple bloodlust. Isabella walked toward the table with her eyes down, her posture suggesting she wanted to be anywhere else but here, her heartbeat audible to Edward's sensitive hearing, the blood pumping through her veins creating a rhythm that matched the burning in his throat and the screaming of his instincts to take what he wanted and deal with consequences later. She sat down on the stool beside him, and he leaned as far away as the small table would allow, his body angled toward the aisle, every muscle locked against the urge to reach for her and tear into her throat and drink until her heart stopped beating and the terrible, beautiful scent finally dissipated because its source no longer lived. She glanced at him tentatively and offered a quiet hello that he could not acknowledge or return. His jaw clenched and his breathing stopped entirely, because breathing meant pulling more of her scent into his lungs, and he was already barely maintaining control with the amount currently overwhelming his senses. The class period became an exercise in survival, Edward counting seconds and then minutes, holding his breath for spans that would have been impossible for humans, but that for him simply meant discomfort rather than actual danger, releasing small, careful breaths when the burning in his lungs became too distracting, and immediately regretting it as her scent flooded his system again and made his control slip another fraction. He read the girl's thoughts desperately, trying to find something in her consciousness that would make her less appealing or more human, or somehow less like the perfect prey his instincts insisted she was. But her mind was completely silent to him, no thoughts accessible despite his gift working perfectly on everyone else in the classroom. The silence, where her consciousness should be creating a void that fascinated and frustrated him in equal measure. Mr. Banner's lecture about cellular mitosis continued obliviously. The teacher's thoughts focused on his presentation and on which students were paying attention. His mental assessment of Edward noting that the boy seemed unusually distracted today, but still probably understanding the material better than most of the class given his consistently perfect grades. Jessica Stanley's thoughts drifted between the lecture and her plans for the weekend, and her assessment of Isabella Swan's appearance and personality, based on the 45 minutes of observation available so far. Mike Newton's thoughts were almost entirely focused on the new girl, his attraction immediate and obvious, his plans already forming to ask her to some school event or another, his confidence that she would say yes based on nothing more than his usual success with girls who found his conventional good looks and his social status appealing. Edward tried to focus on these other minds, using their thoughts as distraction from the girl beside him and the monster inside him demanding her death. But his attention kept returning to the silence where her thoughts should be, and to the scent that made every other blood he had encountered seem bland and unappealing by comparison. He found himself analyzing her physically, since her mind remained closed to him, noting the paleness of her skin and the darkness of her eyes, and the way she held herself with tension that suggested she was uncomfortable being the center of attention, her posture defensive, and her movements economical, as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible. She was pretty in an understated way that the other students were noticing and commenting on in their thoughts, though not beautiful in the conventional sense that Rosalie embodied, or even in the striking way that Alice's delicate features created, just ordinarily attractive in a manner that should not have made her particularly noteworthy or memorable. But the silence of her mind made her extraordinary. The absence of thoughts creating mystery that Edward found almost as compelling as her scent was dangerous. His curiosity about what she might be thinking warring with his need to escape the classroom before his control snapped entirely, and he became the monster he had always feared he truly was beneath the civilized pretense. He wondered if she was thinking about him, if she had noticed his hostile reaction to her presence, if she was hurt or confused or angry about his obvious revulsion. That had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with what she represented to his predatory nature. He wondered what it would be like to hear her thoughts, whether they would be as mundane as most humans, or whether the mind that could block his gift would contain something unusual or interesting that would justify the fascination he was already feeling, despite the very real danger she represented, simply by existing in proximity to him. The bell rang finally. After an hour that felt like several lifetimes, Edward gathering his books and fleeing the classroom with speed that was just barely within human normal range, his control hanging by threads that were fraying with every second he remained near the girl, whose scent and silence had turned his carefully ordered existence into chaos. He made it to his car in the parking lot and sat gripping the steering wheel, his family's thoughts reaching him as they approached. Alice's concern and Jasper's wariness, and Emmett's amusement and Rosalie's satisfaction that Edward was finally experiencing something that challenged his supposedly superior control, all washing over him as they climbed into the Volvo. Alice's vision hit her as Edward started the engine, her precognitive gift showing her two distinct futures branching from this moment. One where Edward hunted Isabella Swan and killed her and destroyed himself in the aftermath, and another where the girl transformed into vampire and stood beside Edward with golden eyes and forever stretching ahead of them both. Edward read the vision in Alice's mind and felt horror at both possibilities. The first because it confirmed his worst fears about his own monstrous nature, and the second because it suggested an intimacy and connection he had never imagined and could not begin to understand how to achieve with a girl whose mind he could not read and whose blood he could barely resist. He drove home in silence despite his siblings' thoughts clamoring around him, their questions and observations and concerns about what had happened in biology class creating noise he could not process, while his mind was still locked on the problem of Isabella Swan and what her existence meant for his carefully maintained control and his carefully constructed identity as the Cullen who never struggled with bloodlust the way Jasper did. Rosalie's thoughts were smugly satisfied that perfect Edward had finally met temptation he could not easily overcome, her resentment at his moral superiority finding validation in his current struggle. Emmett's thoughts were sympathetic and encouraging, his simple nature making him believe that Edward would obviously make the right choice, because that was what Edward always did. Jasper's thoughts were tense and worried, his empathic gift feeling Edward's turmoil and recognizing the genuine danger of a vampire barely maintaining control in a classroom full of humans. Alice's thoughts were the most complex and the most concerning, her visions showing her fragments of possible futures that shifted and changed with every decision Edward considered and discarded. Her certainty that Isabella Swan was important warring with her uncertainty about whether that importance would manifest as tragedy or transformation. She saw Edward hunting the girl through Falk's rain-soaked streets, saw him standing over her drained body in some anonymous location, saw his self-destruction following inevitably from having become the monster he had always feared. But she also saw Edward and Isabella together in ways that suggested partnership and love and connection that defied Alice's understanding of how such a relationship could develop from the current situation, where Edward could barely stand to be in the same room as the girl without wanting to kill her. Edward spent the afternoon and evening hunting in the mountains, draining elk and mountain lion and bear in desperate attempt to saturate himself with blood and reduce the burning thirst that made Isabella Swan's scent so dangerously appealing. His rational mind understanding that this strategy had limited effectiveness, but his desperate instinct insisting that being as full as possible was better than being even slightly thirsty when facing temptation tomorrow. He ran through the forest at full speed, his vampire body moving through the darkness with predatory grace, his mind circling endlessly around the problem of the girl and what he should do about her presence in his biology class and in his previously ordered existence. He could leave Fawkes entirely, withdraw from school, and let his family explain his absence however they chose, remove himself from temptation and eliminate the danger he posed to Isabella Swan's continued existence. But leaving felt like cowardice and like admission of weakness, his pride rebelling against the idea that one human girl could drive him away from his family and his carefully established life simply because her blood smelled appealing and her mind remained mysteriously silent. He could kill her and eliminate the temptation permanently, but that option was unthinkable despite his monster's insistence that it was the simplest solution. His horror at becoming murderer outweighing the very real struggle her presence created for his control and his carefully maintained identity as civilized vampire rather than simple predator. Or he could stay and test himself, prove that his 90 years of control and his commitment to Carlyle's philosophy meant something more substantial than simple convenience that collapsed the moment genuine temptation appeared. Demonstrate to himself and to his family that he was stronger than his base instincts and more committed to preserving human life than to satisfying his thirst, regardless of how powerful that thirst might be. The decision formed slowly through the night as he hunted and ran and circled through the forest, his resolution hardening into determination that he would return to school tomorrow and sit beside Isabella Swan and maintain his control, no matter how difficult or how painful or how much his monster screamed at him to take what it wanted. He would prove he was more than monster, more than predator, more than the sum of his dark urges and his violent capabilities. He would sit beside the silent-minded girl and breathe her intoxicating scent and maintain perfect control because the alternative was unacceptable and because he refused to become the thing he had spent 90 years trying to prove he was not. Despite all evidence suggesting that vampires were fundamentally murderers, regardless of how they dress themselves up, in civilized pretense and philosophical justifications, Isabella Swan would live, and Edward would prove to himself that his control and his commitment to Carlisle's way of life were worth more than one human's appealing blood. No matter how powerfully that blood called to the monster, he kept carefully restrained beneath his civilized surface. Edward returned to Forks after his week in Alaska with the Denali Coven, having resolved absolutely nothing except his determination to attempt coexistence with a girl whose scent had nearly destroyed his control and whose silent mind continued to fascinate him in ways he could not rationalize or dismiss as simple curiosity. Tanya had listened to his description of the situation with sympathy mixed with amusement, her own experience with human temptation giving her perspective on Edward's struggle, but also making her somewhat skeptical of his insistence that this was purely about testing his control rather than about genuine interest in Isabella Swan as person, rather than simply as prey. The Denali sisters had encouraged him to either kill the girl and deal with the consequences, or stay away from Forks entirely, their practical approach to vampire existence making them less committed to Carlisle's philosophical ideals about preserving human life at all costs. But Edward had rejected both suggestions with vehemence that surprised even himself. He hunted obsessively before returning to school, gorging himself on animal blood until his eyes were bright gold and his body was saturated to the point where drinking more would be physically uncomfortable. His strategy being to remove thirst from the equation as much as possible, so that sitting beside Isabella would be test of control rather than immediate life or death struggle against overwhelming instinct. Alice's visions showed him that the girl had noticed his absence, that she had asked Jessica Stanley about Edward and his family with casualness that did not quite hide her genuine curiosity, that she had spent the week sitting alone at their shared lab table, and apparently wondering whether Edward's extreme reaction to her presence meant he was not returning at all. Edward read this information in Alice's thoughts and felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest at the idea that Isabella had been affected by his absence, that she had thought about him during the week he had been gone, that his rudeness and his obvious hostility had registered with her as personal rejection rather than as self-preservation against his own murderous impulses. The first day back at school, Edward changed his approach entirely, his week away having given him time to construct strategy for interacting with Isabella Swan that went beyond simply surviving her proximity without killing her. He introduced himself as if they had never sat together before, offering his hand for her to shake and smiling with warmth. He forced himself to project despite the persistent burning in his throat that her scent created even through his heavy feeding and his careful breath control. Her skin was warm against his cold palm, her heartbeat accelerating at the contact in ways that Edward read as nervousness rather than attraction, though he found himself hoping irrationally that perhaps some component of her reaction was interested, rather than simply startled by his sudden friendliness after a week of absence following his initial hostility. He apologized for his rudeness during their first meeting, offering a carefully constructed lie about having been suffering from a bad cold that had made him irritable and antisocial, the explanation transparently false to anyone who understood that vampires did not get sick, but apparently acceptable to Isabella, who seemed relieved to have any explanation at all for behavior that must have seemed bizarrely hostile and personal. Edward asked her questions about Phoenix and her family, and her reasons for moving to Forks. His attention focused entirely on her responses, even as he simultaneously read the thoughts of everyone else in the classroom. Jessica's envy at Edward's obvious interest in the new girl, warring with her determination to befriend Isabella regardless. Mike's resentment and defeat as he watched Edward accomplish in 5 minutes what Mike had been failing to achieve all week. Isabella's answers were cautious and brief initially, her wariness about Edward's motives evident in her body language, even though her thoughts remained completely inaccessible to his gift. The silence where her consciousness should be continuing to frustrate and fascinate him in ways that made her infinitely more interesting than any other human he had encountered in 9 decades of reading minds. She told him about Phoenix's heat and sunshine and her mother's recent remarriage, and her decision to give Renee and her new husband space by moving to Forks to live with Charlie. The explanation clearly edited and simplified, but containing enough truth that Edward could sense she was not lying, even if she was not telling him everything about her situation or her motivations. He found himself genuinely curious about what she was not saying, about what thoughts were hidden behind her careful responses and her guarded expressions. His inability to simply read her mind, making every conversation with her feel like a puzzle to be solved through careful observation and deduction. The weeks that followed their reset in biology class developed into something Edward had not anticipated and could not quite categorize as friendship or fascination or the beginning of obsession that would eventually consume him entirely and rewrite everything he thought he understood about his own nature and his capacity for feeling things beyond the carefully controlled emotions he had permitted himself for 9 decades. He walked her to her next class after biology, despite having his own class in the opposite direction. His excuse that he was going that way anyway, transparently false, but accepted by Isabella, with small smile that made the burning in his throat feel almost worthwhile. He sat with her at lunch occasionally when his family permitted it. Rosalie's thoughts acidic with disapproval, and Alice's thoughts bright with visions of possible futures that shifted and changed with every small decision Edward made about how much to reveal and how close to let himself get to this fragile human girl. Edward began breaking into Isabella's room at night within 2 weeks of their renewed acquaintance. His justification to himself that he was simply monitoring potential danger to her utterly unconvincing even to his own conscience, but insufficient to stop him from climbing through her window after Charlie fell asleep and settling into the rocking chair in the corner to watch her dream. He told himself that he was protecting her from whatever dangers might threaten her in the night, that his presence ensured nothing could harm her while she was vulnerable and unconscious. But the truth was darker and more selfish than simple protective instinct. His obsession with the girl whose mind he could not read, driving him to observe her in her most unguarded moments in desperate attempt to understand what she thought and felt and wanted from existence. She talked in her sleep occasionally, fragments of sentences that mentioned her mother or school, or sometimes his own name spoken in tones that Edward analyzed obsessively for meaning and context. Her subconscious apparently more forthcoming than her waking mind, even if the information she provided while dreaming was cryptic and incomplete. He memorized the rhythm of her breathing and the expressions that crossed her sleeping face and the way she curled around her pillow as if seeking comfort or warmth. His careful observation cataloguing details that felt simultaneously precious and deeply invasive. His awareness that she had not consented to his presence making each night's vigil feel like violation he could not justify, but also could not stop perpetrating. He read Charlie's thoughts during these nighttime visits, the police chief's mind accessible to Edward even through walls and distance, his paternal concerns about Bella's adjustment to Fawkes, and her friendship with Edward Cullen, mixing with his genuine affection for his daughter and his awkward uncertainty about how to express love through anything other than providing material support and giving her space. Edward developed unexpected respect for Charlie through these second-hand observations. The man's devotion to Bella evident even though he struggled to communicate it directly. His protectiveness balanced by his recognition that controlling her would only drive her away. His quiet presence in her life creating stability she clearly needed even if she did not always appreciate it or acknowledge it openly. The visits to La Push with Bella to see Jacob Black created complications Edward had not anticipated. His inability to read the Quileute boy's mind whenever Jacob was near the boundary line where the treaty prevented Edward from crossing, creating blind spots that frustrated him intensely and made him irrationally jealous of the easy friendship developing between Bella and the tall, gangly teenager who clearly adored her with puppyish devotion that was both innocent and potentially threatening to Edward's own developing attachment. Edward read Bella's face and body language during these visits in desperate attempt to gauge her feelings about Jacob. His relief when she seemed to view the boy as friend rather than romantic prospect, warring with his awareness that friendship could develop into something more and that Jacob could offer Bella sunshine and warmth, a normal human future that Edward could never provide no matter how much he might want to. The meadow became their place in early March. Edward revealing himself in full sunlight for the first time and watching Bella's reaction with anxiety he had not felt since his human life. His certainty that seeing him sparkle like diamond under direct sun would finally trigger the fear and revulsion that any sane human should feel when confronted with clear evidence that he was not human at all. But she reached out to touch his glittering arm with wonder rather than horror, her fascination evident in her expression and her gentle exploration of his crystalline skin, her acceptance so complete and so inexplicable that Edward found himself more frightened by her lack of fear than he had been by the prospect of her rejecting him for being monster. He tried to warn her away from him repeatedly, his descriptions of his nature and his capabilities designed to make her understand the danger she was courting by spending time with predator who wanted her blood more than he had ever wanted anything in his long existence. His honesty about his struggles with control intended to give her information necessary to make informed decision about whether continuing their relationship was worth the very real risk of her own death. But she dismissed his warnings with stubbornness that alternately charmed and terrified him. Her insistence that she trusted him more than he trusted himself, creating responsibility he had not asked for but found himself unable to refuse. Her faith in his goodness, despite all evidence to the contrary, becoming burden and gift simultaneously. The kiss in her bedroom happened in late March after weeks of increasing physical proximity and growing emotional intimacy. Edward's careful control extending to their physical relationship in ways that frustrated Bella. but that he insisted were necessary given the very real danger that losing himself in kissing her might lead to losing control entirely and killing her accidentally through simple enthusiasm or momentary lapse in awareness of his own strength. Her lips were soft and warm against his cold mouth, her heartbeat accelerating to dangerous speeds that made him pull away, despite wanting nothing more than to continue kissing her until neither of them could think or breathe or remember why this was supposed to be dangerous and forbidden. He introduced her to his family formally in early April, the meeting carefully orchestrated by Alice, whose visions had shown multiple versions of this encounter, ranging from awkward but successful to catastrophically violent, depending on variables Edward could not entirely control. Rosalie's thoughts were hostile and resentful throughout Bella's visit. Her judgment that Edward was being selfish and reckless with human life, mixing with deeper anger about Bella's casual attitude toward mortality and transformation that Rosalie herself had never chosen and would give anything to reverse. Emmett's thoughts were amused and welcoming, his simple acceptance of Bella based primarily on Edward's obvious devotion and his own general optimism about most situations. Jasper's thoughts were tense and carefully controlled, his struggle with bloodlust around humans making Bella's presence genuinely difficult for him in ways that created guilt in Edward for exposing his brother to unnecessary temptation. Alice's thoughts were delighted and certain, her visions of Bella as vampire and as family member making the small psychic treat, Bella's integration as inevitable and desirable despite the complications and dangers, her enthusiasm sometime overwhelming Bella, who was still adjusting to the reality of vampires and not yet ready to contemplate her own potential transformation, with Alice's casual acceptance. Carlyle and Esme's thoughts were cautiously supportive, their trust in Edward's judgment warring with their genuine concerns about the risks he was taking and the potential consequences if his control failed, or if Bella's knowledge of their nature was discovered by someone who would use that information to threaten the family's carefully maintained secrecy. The baseball game during a thunderstorm was Alice's idea. Her vision of clear weather with thunder providing cover for the sounds of supernatural strength hitting balls at speeds that would seem impossible to any human observer, making the opportunity too good to pass up, despite the risk of exposing Bella to their full capabilities and their inhuman nature. Edward watched Bella watching them play with mixture of pride and anxiety, her amazement at their speed and strength evident even as she tried to appear casual and accepting, her presence on the sidelines making him simultaneously want to show off and want to protect her from seeing too much of what he truly was beneath the careful human performance he maintained at school. And then James appeared at the clearing's edge with Victoria and Laurent, the nomadic vampires drawn by the sounds of their game and curious about the Cullens they had heard about but never met. Edward reading the tracker's mind and understanding immediately that everything had just changed, and that the casual game had transformed into life or death situation the moment James caught Bella's scent, and his hunting instinct engaged with focus that Edward recognized from his own initial reaction to her blood. James's thoughts were consumed instantly with planning her capture and death, his mind working through strategies and possibilities with practiced efficiency that came from centuries of successful hunts, his awareness that she was protected, making the chase more appealing rather than less, because James preferred prey that required effort and strategy, rather than simple ambush. Edward positioned himself between Bella and the tracker with snarl that communicated absolute willingness to fight and die protecting her. His family arranging themselves similarly in defensive formation that made clear they would all fight if James attempted to take the girl. The territorial display enough to make James back down temporarily, but not enough to eliminate his interest or his intention to hunt Bella eventually when opportunity presented itself. Edward read the tracker's thoughts as he retreated with his coven, understanding that James was already planning and that running would not save Bella because James would follow her anywhere and wait however long necessary to separate her from her protectors and complete the hunt that had become obsession in his mind, just as Bella had become obsession in Edward's. Edward understood immediately from reading James's mind that the tracker was not like other vampires he had encountered, that James's entire existence had been refined and focused into single purpose of hunting prey with skill and patience and obsessive dedication that made him extraordinarily dangerous in ways that went beyond simple physical capability or supernatural strength. James thought in patterns and probabilities, his mind constantly analyzing terrain and tracking methods and potential escape routes his prey might attempt. His centuries of successful hunts, creating database of strategies and countermeasures that he cycled through automatically whenever he identified new quarry worth pursuing. The tracker's thoughts revealed that he considered most hunts boring and simple, that he preferred challenging prey who ran intelligently or who had protectors willing to fight for them, that Bella's presence surrounded by 7 vampires made her infinitely more appealing than she would have been as isolated human wandering alone through some anonymous city. Edward read James's assessment of the Cullen family's capabilities, the tracker cataloguing each vampire's strengths and potential weaknesses with clinical precision that came from experience evaluating opponents and determining how to neutralize or avoid them. James recognized Jasper as the most dangerous combatant based on his scars and his obvious military training, noted Alice's small size as potential vulnerability despite whatever gift she might possess, dismissed Esme and Carlyle as too civilized and too committed to their peaceful philosophy to fight with necessary ruthlessness, calculated that separating Bella from her protectors would require strategy rather than direct confrontation, because fighting all 7 Cullens simultaneously would be suicide even for tracker of James's skill and experience. The plan formed quickly in the Cullen house after they returned from the baseball clearing. Edward reading his family's thoughts as they debated how to protect Bella from tracker, who would not stop hunting her until either he succeeded in killing her or someone destroyed him permanently. Carlyle's thoughts were strategic and calm. Despite the crisis, his centuries of experience giving him perspective on vampire conflicts and their resolution, his immediate assessment being that they needed to split up to confuse James and make tracking Bella more difficult, while also hunting the tracker himself to eliminate the threat rather than simply evading it indefinitely. Esme's thoughts were focused entirely on Bella's safety and on supporting whatever plan would give the girl best chance of survival, her maternal instincts extending to this human who had become important to her son. Jasper's thoughts were tactical and professional, his military background making him natural choice to lead the protection detail, while Edward and Emmett and Carlyle hunted James and his coven. his assessment of the situation clinical and focused on maximizing their advantages while minimizing exposure to James's superior tracking abilities. Alice's visions showed fragments of possible futures that shifted constantly based on James's decisions and the Cullen's responses. Her precognitive gift useful but limited by the tracker's erratic decision-making and his tendency to change plans rapidly based on new information or unexpected obstacles, the futures branching and collapsing and reforming too quickly for Alice to identify a single clear path to Bella's survival. Rosalie's thoughts were angry and resentful. Her judgment that they should simply let the human girl go and allow James to take her rather than risking the entire family for one fragile mortal, creating tension that Edward addressed with snarl and warning that made clear he would fight Rosalie herself if she attempted to interfere with Bella's protection. Emmett's thoughts were eager and supportive, his enthusiasm for the hunt mixing with genuine affection for Bella and loyalty to Edward that made him willing to fight and die if necessary to keep the girl safe from the tracker who had marked her as prey. The flight to Phoenix was agony for Edward, his separation from Bella creating anxiety that made concentration nearly impossible. His ability to read Jasper and Alice's thoughts, the only thing keeping him informed about her safety and her emotional state as they travelled across the country attempting to lead James away from Fawkes and away from Charlie, who would be vulnerable and confused if the tracker chose to use Bella's father as leverage or bait. Edward hunted James with Emmett and Carlisle through the Pacific Northwest, following the tracker's scent and finding only false trails and deliberate misdirection. James's skill at evasion proving as formidable as his skill at hunting. The tracker staying always one step ahead while simultaneously leaving enough traces to keep them pursuing him rather than returning to Bella. Edward read Laurent's mind when they finally caught up with the dark-skinned vampire who had separated from James and Victoria, learning that the tracker and his mate were working together in coordinated strategy that used Laurent as distraction, while James circled back toward Phoenix, where Alice's visions had shown him Bella would eventually flee. Laurent's thoughts revealed genuine fear of James, mixed with admiration for the tracker's abilities. His explanation that James never failed to catch his prey once he committed to a hunt, making Edward's terror for Bella's safety spike into near panic. That Carlisle had to talk him down from through steady reassurance and strategic planning. Victoria's thoughts were elusive, Edward catching only glimpses when they encountered her briefly before she escaped across the treaty line onto Quileute land, where the wolves would prevent her crossing, but where the Cullens also could not follow without breaking the treaty and creating diplomatic incident that would complicate everything. Victoria's mind revealed absolute devotion to James and complete commitment to helping him succeed in his hunt. Her own tactical thinking less sophisticated than her mates, but still effective in creating diversions and false trails that separated the Cullens and prevented them from coordinating their defense of Bella effectively. Alice's phone call reporting that Bella had gone to meet James alone came, while Edward was still hundreds of miles away. His sister's vision showing him the ballet studio and Bella's terror and James's satisfaction at having successfully separated the girl from her protectors through simple manipulation and exploitation of her protective instincts toward her mother. Edward read Alice's frantic thoughts as she and Jasper raced toward the address Bella had provided. her visions showing possible futures where they arrived too late, and Bella died before Edward could reach her. The precognitive images making Edward push his stolen car to speeds that should have been impossible on public highways, but that his vampire reflexes made merely dangerous rather than suicidal. The ballet studio was exactly as Alice's visions had shown. The mirrors and the hardwood floors and the late afternoon sunlight streaming through high windows, creating stage for confrontation that James had orchestrated with deliberate cruelty and theatrical flair. Edward arrived to find Bella already broken and bleeding. James's attack having been brutal and efficient, the tracker's thoughts revealing satisfaction at having hurt Edward through hurting Bella, pleasure at having successfully completed hunt that had been more challenging and therefore more rewarding than most of his previous kills. Edward destroyed James with violence that shocked even himself. His usual control abandoned entirely in favor of rage that demanded the tracker's complete annihilation. His family helping to burn the pieces while Edward focused entirely on Bella, and the venom spreading through her system from the crescent-shaped bite on her wrist. Reading James's dying thoughts was like witnessing the final moments of apex predator who felt no remorse and no fear, only satisfaction at having caused pain and completed his hunt, even if the cost was his own destruction. James's mind held memories of hundreds of successful kills, centuries of prey caught and drained and discarded, his existence having been entirely about the chase and the capture, with no higher purpose or deeper meaning beyond the satisfaction of tracking and killing. Edward saw himself reflected in those dying thoughts, recognized the monster he could have become if he had chosen hunting over Carlyle's philosophy, understood that the line between himself and James was thinner than he had ever wanted to acknowledge. The decision to suck the venom from Bella's wound, rather than let her transform, was made in seconds. Edward's certainty that she deserved human life and human choices, outweighing any selfish desire to keep her with him forever, through transformation she had not chosen or consented to in any meaningful way. Carlyle's thoughts guided him through the process, his father's steady mental voice reminding Edward when to stop and how to control the instinct to keep drinking once he started. The taste of Bella's blood even better than her scent had promised. The venom-laced sweetness making stopping feel like the hardest thing Edward had ever attempted, despite knowing that continuing would kill her. He pulled away when Carlyle told him to, his body shaking with effort of overcoming instinct that screamed at him to finish what he had started, to drain her completely and satisfy the thirst that had been burning in his throat since the first moment he encountered her in biology class months ago. But he stopped because Carlyle believed he could, and because Bella deserved to live, and because loving her meant protecting her even from himself and his own selfish desires to keep her in whatever form that keeping might take. The hospital vigil afterward was torture of different kind. Edward sitting beside Bella's bed, reading the thoughts of doctors and nurses who treated her injuries without understanding their supernatural origin. Listening to Charlie's panicked thoughts as he processed the story about Bella falling through a window in Phoenix and nearly dying from blood loss and trauma. Renee's thoughts were guilty and frightened. Her awareness that her daughter had come to Phoenix because of her making the accident feel like her fault, even though she had no context for understanding what had actually happened or why Bella had really been in that ballet studio. Edward read Bella's unconscious mind desperately during those hours, hoping that her lowered defenses might finally allow him access to her thoughts and feelings. But even in coma, her mind remained completely silent to him, the mystery of her consciousness still impenetrable despite everything they had been through together. He held her hand and memorized her sleeping face and made promises to himself about leaving her once she recovered, about giving her back her normal human life and removing himself from her existence so she could be safe from trackers and from him and from the supernatural world that had nearly killed her. But even as he made these promises, Edward knew he would not keep them. His love for her too strong, and his need for her presence too overwhelming to allow him to do what was right and noble and self-sacrificing. He would stay because leaving was impossible, because she had become essential to his existence in ways he could not explain or justify, because the silence of her mind and the sweetness of her blood and the trust in her eyes when she looked at him had transformed him from a monster pretending to be civilized into something that might actually deserve the love she offered, despite all evidence suggesting he was fundamentally unworthy of her faith in his goodness. Spring in Forks arrived with marginally less rain and slightly warmer temperatures that transformed the endless grey into occasional glimpses of pale sunlight filtering through the perpetual cloud cover, the forest's oppressive green becoming almost beautiful when illuminated by rare afternoon light that made the moss glow emerald and the undergrowth seem lush rather than simply overwhelming. Edward experienced this familiar seasonal transition differently than he had in previous years. His perception of Forks transformed by Bella's presence from dreary prison requiring endurance into place where he could be genuinely happy for the first time, since his human life ended in that Chicago hospital 90 years earlier. He allowed himself contentment he had never permitted before. His usual self-loathing and conviction of his own monstrosity, temporarily suspended by Bella's absolute faith that he was good despite all evidence suggesting he was fundamentally predator, pretending to have soul or conscience or capacity for genuine love rather than simple possessive obsession. The school's collective consciousness buzzed constantly with speculation about Edward and Bella's relationship, their obvious devotion to each other creating gossip that Edward read in dozens of minds simultaneously whenever he walked through the hallways or sat in the cafeteria. Jessica Stanley's thoughts were envious and fascinated. Her detailed mental cataloguing of every interaction between Edward and Bella, revealing both genuine friendship and underlying resentment that the new girl had captured the attention of the one boy Jessica had always considered too beautiful and too mysterious to be genuinely available. Mike Newton's thoughts were bitter and defeated, his crush on Bella transforming into resigned acceptance mixed with lingering hope that perhaps Edward would eventually tire of her or leave Forks and create opportunity for Mike to resume his unsuccessful pursuit. Angela Weber's thoughts were kind and romantic, her genuine happiness for Bella's relationship with Edward unmarred by envy or judgment. Her observations about their dynamic, gentle, and perceptive in ways that made Edward respect her more than most humans, whose thoughts he encountered daily. Eric Yorkie's thoughts were curious and slightly intimidated, his awareness that Edward was somehow dangerous mixing with his inability to articulate what specific threat Edward represented, beyond general sense that someone so perfect and so controlled must be hiding something significant beneath the polished surface. Tyler Crowley's thoughts remained apologetic and anxious whenever he saw Bella. His guilt about the van accident that had nearly killed her persisting months later. Despite her repeated assurances that she held no grudge and considered the incident completely resolved. Edward read Charlie's thoughts during the evenings when he visited Bella officially through the front door rather than through her bedroom window. The police chief's mind revealing complicated mix of approval and concern about his daughter's serious relationship with Boy, who seemed too old and too intense for 17-year-old girl still adjusting to life in Forks. Charlie worried that Bella was too invested too quickly, that her obvious devotion to Edward suggested unhealthy attachment rather than normal teenage romance, that the boy's formal manners and his careful distance when Charlie was present indicated someone performing a role rather than simply being himself. But Charlie also recognized that Bella was happier than she had been since arriving in Forks, that Edward treated her with respect and obvious adoration, that forbidding the relationship would only drive Bella away and damage the fragile father-daughter bond they had been carefully rebuilding over the past months. The nighttime visits to Bella's room continued and intensified, Edward's presence during her sleeping hours becoming ritual they both depended on, even though the violation inherent in watching her without her conscious awareness never quite stopped bothering his conscience, or his sense that he was taking liberties she had not explicitly granted. He climbed through a window after Charlie fell asleep and settled into the rocking chair, or sometimes lay carefully beside her on the bed when she asked him to stay close, his cold body pressed against her warmth, her steady heartbeat and rhythmic breathing creating peace he had never experienced in 90 years of restless, immortal existence. She talked to him in her sleep more frequently now, full sentences occasionally emerging from her dreams, his name spoken with affection that made his unnecessary heart feel like it was swelling, despite its permanent stillness. They discussed her future with increasing frequency and increasing tension. Edward's desire for Bella to experience normal human milestones like college and career and aging, naturally warring with her insistence that she wanted transformation sooner rather than later, that every day she remained human was day she grew older while he remained frozen at 17, that the gap between them would only widen if she delayed becoming vampire until after completing college, or traveling, or whatever other human experiences Edward believed she should have before surrendering her mortality. Edward read her determination in her expressions and her body language, since her thoughts remained stubbornly inaccessible. His frustration at not being able to simply know what she was thinking, making their arguments circular and unresolved, both of them repeating the same positions without making progress toward compromise or mutual understanding. He wanted her to have choices and experiences that transformation would foreclose forever. Wanted her to go to college and make human friends and see the world and kiss other boys, and determined through actual lived experience rather than teenage certainty that he was truly what she wanted for eternity. But Bella dismissed these suggestions with stubbornness that both charmed and frustrated him. Her insistence that she had already made her choice, and that delaying transformation was simply wasting time. They could be spending together as equals rather than as vampire and fragile human, requiring constant protection and accommodation. Edward read similar arguments in Alice's visions of their conversations, his sister's precognitive gift showing him that this fundamental disagreement would persist and intensify regardless of how many times they discussed it, or how many different approaches he attempted to convince Bella that rushing into transformation was a mistake she would eventually regret. The trip to visit the Denali Coven in Alaska happened in May. Edward wanting Bella to meet the extended family and to understand that the Cullens were not the only vampires attempting to live according to Carlyle's philosophy of coexistence with humans rather than predation upon them. Tanya's thoughts when she met Bella were gracious and welcoming on the surface, but underneath carried currents of loss and resignation. Her own long-term interest in Edward finally and definitively ended by Bella's presence and Edward's obvious complete devotion to the human girl. Tanya had pursued Edward casually for decades, her thoughts revealing genuine affection mixed with recognition that he was too damaged and too self-loathing to accept romantic relationship even with someone who understood vampire existence and its complications. Her observation of Edward with Bella showing her that he had transformed in ways she had never managed to inspire or encourage during their long acquaintance. Kate and Irina's thoughts were curious and amused, their assessment of Bella kind, but also somewhat skeptical that human girl could truly understand what she was asking for when she insisted she wanted transformation and eternity with vampires, their own experiences with human lovers who had aged and died while they remained unchanged, making them protective of Bella in ways that manifested as warnings about the permanent nature of transformation and the impossibility of reversing the choice once made. Elazar's thoughts were analytical and fascinated. His gift for sensing other vampires' abilities making him intensely curious about Bella's apparent immunity to mental powers. His assessment that she possessed shield of some kind, even as human, suggesting that her transformation would enhance this natural defense into something potentially quite powerful and useful. Edward found unexpected comfort in the Denali sisters' acceptance of Bella, despite their reservations about her mortality and her desire for transformation. Their willingness to welcome her into the extended family, making his relationship with her feel more legitimate and more sustainable than it had when confined entirely to Fawkes and the judgment of his immediate family. He read their genuine affection for Bella, developing over the long weekend visit, their thoughts shifting from skepticism to actual fondness as they observed her personality and her humor, and her complete lack of fear around vampires who could kill her casually if they chose to indulge their baser instincts. Summer arrived with Fawkes' version of warmth, temperatures climbing into the 60s and occasional 70s, the sun making more frequent appearances, though never reliably enough to prevent Edward and his family from maintaining their usual routines and attendance at school until graduation in early June, freed them from the daily performance of being normal teenagers. Edward and Bella spent long days together, hiking through the forest to places where they could be alone and undisturbed, swimming in isolated lakes where the cold water did not bother Edward, and where Bella's shivering gave him excuse to hold her close and share what little warmth his body could absorb from sunlight and transfer to her chilled skin. He played piano for her in the Cullen house, his fingers moving over keys with technical perfection that had lost all emotional content decades ago, but that somehow regained feeling when Bella was listening, her presence in the room making music feel meaningful again. rather than simply mechanical exercise in reproducing notes he had memorized a century earlier. He composed for her melodies that attempted to capture her essence, though he knew that without access to her thoughts, his musical portrait of her would always be incomplete and based on observation rather than genuine understanding of her internal landscape. The lullaby he created becoming her favorite despite his own assessment that it was inadequate representation of her complexity and her contradiction. The engagement happened in July, though they told no one initially. Edward's proposal formal and old-fashioned in ways that made Bella simultaneously touched and exasperated. His insistence on marriage before physical intimacy or transformation rooted in values from his human era that seemed archaic and unnecessary to a girl raised in the casualness of late 20th century American culture. He presented her with a ring that had belonged to his mother Elizabeth, the Edwardian setting and the oval diamond perfect for Bella's hand, despite her protest that she did not want or need expensive jewelry or formal commitment beyond their mutual understanding that they intended forever together. Edward read her acceptance in her expression and her body language, even though he could not read her thoughts. Her resistance to marriage softening when she understood how important this tradition was to him, and how deeply his century-old values required this formal declaration before he could feel comfortable proceeding with plans for her transformation. They agreed to wait until after graduation to announce the engagement. Bella's desire to avoid drama and speculation from her classmates, making her insist on privacy until they had both finished high school and could make their plans without interference or commentary from people whose opinions did not matter to their actual future. Edward agreed reluctantly, his own preference being to declare their commitment publicly and immediately, his possessive nature wanting everyone to know that Bella had chosen him and was promised to him, regardless of what Charlie or Renee or the school's collective consciousness might think about teenagers making permanent commitments. The summer days blurred together in contentment Edward had never expected to experience. His existence transformed from endurance into actual living, his careful observation of Bella's expressions and gestures and choices providing endless fascination that never quite compensated for the silence where her thought should be, but that created intimacy he valued precisely because it required effort and attention, rather than the passive reception of information his gift usually provided. He memorized her completely, every freckle and every expression and every habit, his vampire memory ensuring that nothing about her would ever fade or become uncertain. His awareness that her human life was temporary, making him cherish these moments, even as he looked forward to her transformation and the eternity that would follow when she would finally be his equal rather than his fragile responsibility requiring constant vigilance. Alice had been planning Bella's 18th birthday celebration for weeks, despite Bella's repeated protests that she did not want party or presents or any acknowledgement of aging another year, while Edward remained frozen at 17. The age gap between them widening with each passing month in ways that made Bella increasingly anxious about delaying transformation, while Edward insisted she experience human milestones before surrendering her mortality forever. Alice's visions showed her the party at the Cullen house with decorations and cake, and the family gathered to celebrate this human tradition that vampires observed primarily for Bella's sake. rather than because birthdays held any real meaning for beings who no longer aged or changed or moved through time in the linear progression that marked human existence. Edward read Alice's thoughts and saw the party preparations and the vision of Bella opening presents surrounded by his family. The futures Alice observed showing celebration proceeding smoothly and ending with Bella happy despite her initial reluctance to be the center of attention. Edward felt uneasy throughout the day of September 13th. Though he could not identify specific reason for his anxiety beyond general awareness that gathering Bella with 7 vampires to celebrate her humanity seemed unnecessarily dangerous and potentially provocative of the very instincts they all work so carefully to control every moment of their existence. He read Jasper's thoughts during the drive to the Cullen house and found his brother's mind tense and carefully regulated. Jasper's empathic gift making him sensitive to the emotions of everyone present and requiring him to maintain rigid control over his own responses to avoid being overwhelmed by the collective feeling in any room he occupied. Jasper had been struggling more than usual recently, his thoughts revealing that Bella's constant presence was wearing on his control in ways that created guilt and self-loathing. His awareness that he was weakest link in the family's protection of Bella, making him feel like failure and liability despite Alice's reassurances that he was managing admirably given the circumstances. The party itself began well enough, Alice directing Bella to open presents with enthusiasm that was slightly manic, even for Alice, whose normal effect was energetic and intense. The decorations tasteful and elegant in shades of white and silver that transformed the Cullens' living room into space appropriate for celebration without being ostentatious or overwhelming. Edward stood close to Bella throughout the evening, his body positioned between her and Jasper in unconscious protective gesture that he only recognized when he read Carlyle's thoughts and saw his father's assessment that Edward was displaying territorial behavior usually associated with mated pairs guarding their chosen partner from potential threats. Rosalie's thoughts were resentful and dismissive, her judgment that celebrating Bella's aging was a cruel reminder of mortality, and her conviction that Edward was being selfish and reckless, making her participation in the party perfunctory and obviously reluctant. Emmett's thoughts were cheerful and genuine, his simple nature allowing him to enjoy the party for what it was, without overthinking the complications or the inherent strangeness of vampires gathering to celebrate human birthday. His affection for Bella, having developed genuinely over the months she had been part of their lives, despite his initial skepticism about Edward's relationship with human girl. Esme's thoughts were warm and maternal, her love for Bella already established and growing stronger with each interaction, her desire to welcome Bella into the family officially through transformation, warring with her understanding that Edward wanted Bella to have more time as human before making irrevocable choice to join them in immortality. Carlyle's thoughts were measured and cautious, his awareness of the risks they were taking by having Bella present among so many vampires balanced by his trust in his family's control and his recognition that isolating Bella from family gatherings would only delay inevitable integration that would happen when she transformed. He watched Jasper carefully, his thoughts monitoring his son's control, and noting the tension in Jasper's posture and the careful regulation of his breathing that suggested, was struggling more than he wanted to admit or acknowledge openly. The paper cut happened when Bella was opening Alice and Jasper's gift, the wrapping paper's edge slicing across her finger with sharpness that drew blood immediately, single drop welling up bright red against her pale skin before she could react or hide it or do anything to prevent what happened next. Edward heard Jasper's thoughts transform in an instant from careful control to pure predatory instinct, his brother's mind going blank except for single overwhelming imperative to feed, to take, to drink from the source of fresh human blood that every vampire in the room could smell, but that called to Jasper with particular intensity because of his struggles and his weakened control and his empathic gift amplifying his own thirst through feedback loop of everyone else's desire. Edward moved without conscious thought, his body reacting to Jasper's lunge before his mind fully processed what was happening. His hands finding Bella and throwing her backward away from Jasper's trajectory with force meant to save her life. But that sent her crashing into the table, where Esme's crystal and glass decorations shattered under her impact. The sound of breaking glass mixed with Bella's cry of pain and the scent of more blood as the broken edges cut her arm deeply, the wound bleeding freely and making the situation exponentially worse as every vampire in the room fought against instinct that screamed at them to feed on the injured human girl bleeding in their living room. Edward read the thoughts of his family as they struggled with control. Emmett's mind showing him grabbing Jasper and restraining him physically, while Alice added her own strength to keeping her mate from reaching Bella. Rosalie's thoughts revealing satisfaction mixed with horror as she watched the scene confirm her predictions that having human around vampires was dangerous and irresponsible regardless of how careful they believed they were being. Carlyle's thoughts remained calm and focused, his centuries of medical practice giving him ability to function around human blood that the others lacked, his immediate assessment being that he needed to clear the room of everyone except himself and Edward, while he treated Bella's injuries and determined how serious the cuts were and whether she needed hospital care beyond what he could provide. Esme ushered everyone out quickly, her thoughts gentle and concerned for both Bella and Jasper. Her awareness that her son would be devastated by this loss of control, making her want to comfort him, even as she recognized that Bella's immediate physical safety had to take priority over Jasper's emotional distress. Edward read Jasper's thoughts as Emmett and Alice dragged him from the house, his brother's mind filled with self-hatred and shame and horror at what he had nearly done, the guilt already consuming him before he was even fully back in control of his faculties and able to think coherently about the attack he had just attempted on the girl his family was sworn to protect. Edward stood across the room from where Carlyle was examining Bella's arm, his own control tested in ways it had not been since that first day in biology class, when her scent had nearly destroyed his carefully maintained restraint, the fresh blood calling to him with intensity that made his hands shake and his vision narrow and his throat burn with thirst that demanded satisfaction regardless of consequences. He read Carlyle's thoughts and found his father's assessment that the cuts were deep but not life-threatening, that stitches would be required, but that Bella would heal completely given proper care and time, that the danger had passed, and everyone had maintained control despite how close they had come to catastrophe. But Edward's thoughts were spiraling into darkness that had nothing to do with bloodlust and everything to do with recognition that he had been deluding himself about the sustainability of his relationship with Bella. That tonight had proven beyond any doubt that keeping her in his world was selfish and dangerous and would eventually result in her death, whether by accident or by moment of lost control from himself or from one of his family members. He read his own thoughts as he would read anyone else's and saw the decision forming even as he tried to fight against it. His certainty that leaving Bella was the only way to keep her safe warring with his equally strong certainty that leaving her would destroy them both in different ways, but with equal finality. Carlyle stitched Bella's arm with steady hands, while Edward watched from across the room, unable to come closer because the scent of her blood was still too strong and his control was still too fragile. His father's thoughts showing concern not just for Bella's physical injuries, but for Edward's mental state and the self-destructive conclusions he could sense his son reaching through observation of Edward's body language and expression. Carlyle tried to reassure Edward mentally, his thoughts projecting calm certainty that tonight's incident was unfortunate but manageable, that Jasper would recover from his slip and that the family's control overall had been adequate to prevent actual tragedy, that using this incident as justification for ending his relationship with Bella would be overreaction born from fear rather than rational assessment of actual danger. But Edward could not accept these reassurances, his mind showing him endless variations of futures where moments of lost control resulted in Bella's death, where his own thirst or Jasper's weakness or simple accident in their presence led to her being drained and killed by the family that claimed to love her and protect her. He saw himself bending over her corpse with blood on his mouth and horror in his heart. Saw Jasper living with guilt that would never fade. Saw Alice's visions showing Bella's death in dozens of different scenarios that all ended the same way, with the fragile human girl destroyed by proximity to predators who could not be trusted no matter how civilized they pretended to be, or how committed they claimed to be to Carlyle's philosophy of coexistence. The drive back to Bella's house was silent. Edward's thoughts too chaotic and too dark to allow for conversation that would require him to pretend everything was fine, when in fact, everything had just shattered as completely as the glass and crystal that had cut Bella's arm. He read her attempts to start conversation and to reassure him that she was not angry at Jasper and did not blame anyone for what had happened. Her thoughts still silent to him, but her intentions obvious in her body language and her gentle touches to his arm that he could barely feel through the numbness spreading through his consciousness like ice forming over water that had been liquid moments before. He asked her to walk with him in the forest the next day, his request polite and formal in ways that should have warned her something terrible was coming, but that she apparently interpreted as simple desire for privacy and conversation away from Charlie's potential observation. They walked deep enough into the trees that the house disappeared from view, the forest closing around them with its usual oppressive density, rain dripping steadily from the canopy overhead, creating rhythm that matched the slow, methodical destruction of everything Edward had allowed himself to hope for over the past 8 months. He had rehearsed his speech during the sleepless night, his words carefully chosen to achieve maximum effect, with minimum opportunity for Bella to argue or negotiate or convince him to reconsider a decision he knew was right, even though it felt like dying would be preferable to what he was about to do. He told her he was leaving Forks, that his family was moving away, the lie simple and clean and completely inadequate to explain what was really happening or why he had decided that destroying both of them was somehow better than continuing to risk her life through his selfish desire to keep her close. He read her relief in her expression when she thought she was simply being told about a move she could follow them to. Her willingness to go anywhere and do anything to stay with him, evident in the way her posture relaxed and her breathing steadied. Her certainty that geography could not separate them, making what came next even more cruel and necessary. He told her she could not come with him, that this was goodbye, emphasizing the word with inflection designed to make its finality absolutely clear and completely devastating. His careful cruelty, motivated by belief that making her hate him was kinder than leaving her hoping he might return or change his mind. He delivered the lies he had prepared about not wanting her, about her being a distraction that had run its course, about his family being relieved when she was no longer part of their lives, each word a knife he was deliberately driving into her heart because he believed that pain now would save her from death later. He read her heartbreak in her face, even though he could not read her thoughts, her expression showing him that she understood he was lying, but that the lies were still destroying her exactly as he intended them to. Her tears starting before he finished speaking and continuing as she begged him not to do this, and tried to convince him that danger was acceptable price for staying together. He remained unmoved by her pleas, because moving would mean reconsidering, and reconsidering would mean staying, and staying would mean eventually killing her through accident or loss of control or simple mathematical inevitability of fragile humans spending time among vampires who are fundamentally predators, regardless of how well they played at being civilized. He promised her that he would make it as if he had never existed, that she would move on and have normal human life and forget about vampires entirely. The promises hollow and impossible, but spoken with conviction. He did not feel, and certainty he could not sustain once he actually walked away and left her standing alone in the forest. He told her not to do anything reckless, not to put herself in danger trying to get his attention or force his return. The warning motivated by his knowledge of her personality and his fear that she would hurt herself attempting to bring him back to her. And then he left, disappearing into the forest with vampire speed that made pursuit impossible. His last image of her, the sight of her standing motionless among the trees, with rain falling and darkness approaching, and absolute devastation written across every line of her body and face. The girl he loved more than his own existence left alone and broken because he had decided that her safety mattered more than her happiness or his own. Edward tracked Victoria across 3 continents through October and November and into December. His pursuit of the red-haired vampire consuming all his attention and providing purpose that prevented him from thinking too deeply about what he had done to Bella, or whether his decision to leave her had been right, or simply cowardice dressed up as noble sacrifice. Victoria's thoughts, when he could read them, were focused entirely on revenge for James's death, her mind constantly planning and revising strategies for reaching Bella and killing her in ways that would cause Edward maximum pain before his own inevitable destruction. the mate-for-mate logic driving her obsession, making her simultaneously predictable and extremely dangerous, because her single-minded focus made her willing to take risks and endure hardships that more rational vampires would avoid. He followed her scent through South America, where she spent weeks hiding among the covens that controlled various territories, her presence tolerated because she was passing through rather than attempting to establish permanent residence or challenge existing power structures. Edward's pursuit complicated by the need to avoid conflicts with vampires who viewed his tracking of Victoria through their lands as potential invasion or threat to their authority. He read the thoughts of coven leaders who questioned his purposes and his right to hunt through territories they considered their exclusive domain. His explanations about protecting a human girl from Tracker's revenge met with skepticism and amusement from vampires who could not understand why he cared about one human survival enough to chase Victoria across continents and through dangerous political situations. Victoria stayed always one step ahead, her thoughts revealing that she was aware of Edward's pursuit and was leading him deliberately away from Fawkes and away from Bella, her strategy being to exhaust him and frustrate him until he made a mistake or gave up entirely and returned to whatever hole he was hiding in, while she circled back to complete her revenge against the girl who had been responsible for James's death. Edward understood her strategy, but could not abandon the hunt without leaving Bella vulnerable to Victoria's eventual return. His certainty that the tracker would never stop seeking revenge, making his pursuit necessary regardless of how futile it seemed, or how many months he spent following cold trails and false leads across landscapes that blurred together into undifferentiated backdrop for his misery. The family had scattered after leaving Fawkes, Carlisle and Esme relocating to New York, where Carlisle took position and hospital in Manhattan, and Esme involved herself in restoration projects that gave her purpose and creative outlet. Their thoughts when Edward checked in with them periodically, showing concern for his well-being and gentle suggestions that perhaps he should return to Bella rather than continuing this self-destructive exile that was helping no one and protecting nothing except his own pride and his conviction that martyrdom was somehow superior to happiness. Alice and Jasper had gone to ground somewhere. Edward could not track them. Alice deliberately keeping her location hidden to avoid Edward reading her visions and learning information about Bella that he had forbidden his family from sharing with him. Her anger at his decision to leave Bella evident in a refusal to communicate with him beyond occasional brief messages confirming she and Jasper were safe. Rosalie and Emmett were in Africa, the isolation appealing to Rosalie's desire for distance from human civilization, and Emmett's enthusiasm for hunting exotic prey, making the savannah and jungle appropriate location for them to spend few years before needing to relocate again. Edward read Emmett's thoughts when his brother called occasionally to check in, finding sympathy and confusion in equal measure. Emmett's simple nature making him unable to understand why Edward had chosen to be miserable and alone when he could have been happy with Bella, regardless of the complications and dangers that relationship entailed. Rosalie's thoughts were judgmental and satisfied. Her conviction that Edward's relationship with Bella had been selfish and dangerous validated by his decision to leave. Her own resentment about her forced transformation into vampire making her incapable of sympathizing with Bella's desire to choose immortality voluntarily. Edward's existence contracted to hunting and tracking and the endless internal monologue of self-justification and self-recrimination that characterized his thoughts whenever he was not actively reading other minds or pursuing Victoria's fading trail across another border or through another city. He had been alone before during his rebellious decade in the 1920s and 30s, but this isolation felt different and worse because he was choosing it deliberately rather than simply fleeing Carlyle's philosophy. His awareness that he could return to his family or to Bella at any moment, making the loneliness feel like punishment he was inflicting on himself for crimes he could not quite articulate, but that felt enormous and unforgivable. He thought about Bella constantly, despite his attempts to focus on Victoria, or on hunting, or on anything else that might distract him from the aching absence where her presence had been. His vampire memory ensuring that every moment with her remained perfectly preserved and accessible. Every expression and gesture and word available for him to replay endlessly during the long, empty nights when he had nothing to do except remember and regret and wonder whether she was managing without him, or whether his departure had destroyed her as completely as it had destroyed him. He wanted desperately to know how she was, but had forbidden Alice from telling him, and had forbidden himself from calling Charlie or checking in with anyone in Forks who might provide information about Bella's well-being. His certainty that knowing would make leaving impossible warring with his equal certainty that staying away was necessary for her safety, regardless of what it cost them both. Alice's visions began appearing in her thoughts in late February, when Edward checked in with Carlyle to provide update on Victoria's location and his continued failure to catch the tracker despite months of pursuit. Alice's precognitive gift showing her fragments of Bella in danger. Bella deliberately seeking out dangerous situations. Bella's face appearing in visions that Alice was projecting loudly enough that Edward could not avoid reading them, even though he tried to block out information about Bella's current state. He saw Bella on a motorcycle looking exhilarated and reckless, saw her cliff diving into churning ocean during storm, saw her face gaunt and her eyes empty in ways that suggested she was not coping well with his absence, despite his hope that she would recover and move on and build normal human life that did not include vampires or supernatural dangers. Edward dismissed Alice's visions as manipulation. His certainty that his sister was trying to guilt him into returning to Bella, making him refuse to accept that the images she was showing him represented genuine concern, rather than simply strategic attempt to undermine his resolve to stay away. He told himself that Bella was resilient, and that Charlie would protect her, and that her human friends would support her through whatever grief his departure had caused. His rationalizations growing thinner and less convincing with each vision, Alice showed him of Bella's deteriorating condition and increasingly reckless behavior. He read Alice's frustration in her thoughts, her anger at his stubbornness, and his refusal to accept that leaving Bella had not protected her, but had instead left her vulnerable in different ways that were potentially just as dangerous as vampire attack. Victoria's trail went cold in Argentina in early March, Edward losing her scent entirely after following her through Buenos Aires and into the countryside where she simply disappeared as if she had never existed. His tracking abilities inadequate to locate vampire who was deliberately hiding, and who had centuries of experience evading pursuit. He spent weeks searching the areas where he had last detected her presence, reading the thoughts of humans and vampires alike, trying to find anyone who had seen her or knew where she had gone. His frustration mounting as he realized that she had successfully evaded him, and that his months of pursuit had accomplished nothing except keeping him away from Bella, while Victoria presumably circled back toward Forks to complete her revenge. The phone call from Rosalie came on March 15th, while Edward was in Rio de Janeiro, preparing to return to North America and resume his search for Victoria in places closer to Forks, where the tracker would eventually surface if her obsession with revenge remained as strong as Edward believed it to be. Rosalie's voice was formal and slightly smug, her pleasure at being messenger of terrible news evident even through the phone connection, her thoughts broadcasting satisfaction that she was about to deliver information that would devastate Edward and prove that his noble sacrifice had been pointless and stupid. She told him that Alice had called her with vision of Bella jumping off cliff in La Push, that Alice's precognitive sight had shown Bella falling, and then nothing, the blankness after the jump suggesting death to Alice's gift, and prompting her to go to Forks to comfort Charlie and confirm what her visions had shown. Edward heard Rosalie's words, but their meaning took several seconds to penetrate his consciousness fully, his mind refusing initially to process the information that Bella was dead, that she had killed herself jumping off cliff, that his leaving had not protected her, but had instead driven her to suicide that ended her life just as certainly as vampire attack would have. Rosalie's thoughts showed him that she believed this was Edward's fault, that his departure had caused Bella's depression and her reckless behavior and ultimately her death, that his conviction that leaving would keep her safe had been proven catastrophically wrong by Alice's vision of Bella's broken body at the bottom of La Push cliffs. The decision to seek his own death formed instantly and completely. Edward's certainty that world without Bella was not worth existing in making the choice simple and obvious, his only question being how to accomplish his destruction in a way that would be certain and final, given that vampires were nearly impossible to kill without help from other vampires willing to tear them apart and burn the pieces. The Volturi were the obvious answer. The ancient vampire royalty in Italy who enforced their laws and maintained order among their kind, their power absolute, and their willingness to destroy rule breakers well established through centuries of example. Edward's plan forming to force their hand by breaking their most fundamental law about exposing vampire nature to human awareness. He would go to Volterra and reveal himself in sunlight during St. Marcus Day festival, when the plaza would be crowded with tourists celebrating the vampire hunting saint, whose feast day coincided ironically with the actual vampire coven ruling from beneath the city, his sparkling skin visible to hundreds or thousands of humans who would report what they had seen and create exposure that the Volturi could not ignore or allow to stand without punishment. Aro would have no choice but to destroy him for such blatant violation. Edward's death would be swift and certain, and he would be reunited with Bella in whatever came after death, or he would simply cease to exist, and either option was preferable to continuing his empty existence knowing she was gone, and that his leaving had caused her death rather than preventing it. He booked flight to Italy immediately, Rosalie's satisfaction at having delivered the news fading into uncertainty as she read his thoughts and understood what he was planning. Her attempts to argue with him or convince him to wait for confirmation before doing something irreversible falling on deaf ears, because Edward had already made his decision, and nothing Rosalie could say would change his resolve to follow Bella into death, rather than exist without her. He moved through the airport and onto the plane mechanically, his mind numb and his thoughts circular, replaying Alice's vision of Bella jumping and falling and the terrible blankness that followed, suggesting her consciousness had simply ended and she no longer existed anywhere in any form he could reach or find or join except through his own death. The flight across the Atlantic was interminable. Edward, unable to sleep or rest or think about anything except Bella, and his failure to protect her, and his arrogant certainty that leaving had been the right choice, when in fact it had been the worst decision he had ever made in 90 years of existence. He read the thoughts of passengers around him and found their concerns about work and family and vacation plans utterly meaningless and incomprehensible. His inability to care about anything except his own loss, making him feel even more monstrous and isolated than usual. His awareness that he was choosing death over continuing to exist, creating strange calm that felt almost like peace after months of misery and self-inflicted exile. Volterra rose from the Tuscan countryside like medieval fortress carved from golden stone. The ancient city perched on his hilltop, surveying farmland and vineyards that had sustained human civilization in this region for thousands of years before the Volturi established their court beneath the streets and began their reign over vampire kind that had lasted nearly 3 millennia. Edward arrived in Florence and stole a car from the airport parking garage with casual disregard for human laws that no longer mattered to someone planning his own execution within hours. His driving reckless and fast as he navigated the winding roads through Tuscany toward the city, where he would force the Volturi to destroy him for crimes against their most fundamental rule about secrecy and concealment of vampire nature from human awareness. The St. Marcus Day festival filled Volterra's narrow streets with tourists wearing red robes in celebration of the vampire hunting saint, whose legendary purging of vampires from the region created ironic counterpoint to the reality of vampire royalty living beneath the city in chambers that predated most of the surface structures by centuries. Edward read the thoughts of celebrating humans as he moved through the crowds toward the plaza, their excitement about the festival and their complete ignorance of actual vampires in their midst, creating cognitive dissonance that would have been amusing under different circumstances, but that now simply reinforced his conviction that exposing himself would create the crisis necessary to force Aro's hand and achieve the death he was seeking. He had positioned himself in shadow doorway near the plaza's edge, his plan being to wait until the clock tower struck noon and the festival reached its peak of attendance before stepping into the sunlight and revealing his sparkling skin to the maximum number of witnesses possible, ensuring that the Volturi would have no choice but to execute him for creating exposure they could not contain or explain away through their usual methods of manipulation and selective memory alteration. Edward's thoughts were calm and resolved as he waited for the appointed time. His certainty that death was preferable to existence without Bella making the prospect of his own destruction feel like relief rather than tragedy. his only regret being that he had wasted the months since leaving her in pointless pursuit of Victoria, instead of spending that time with Bella and accepting whatever dangers that proximity entailed. Alice's phone call came minutes before noon, her voice frantic and her thoughts chaotic as she screamed at him that Bella was alive, that the vision had been wrong or misinterpreted, that he needed to stop whatever he was planning immediately, because Bella had not died jumping off the cliff, but had been saved by one of the Quaalude boys, and was perfectly fine if somewhat concerned about Edward's whereabouts and well-being. Edward's mind refused initially to process this information. The whiplash from certainty of Bella's death to possibility of her survival too extreme to integrate coherently. His thoughts fragmenting between desperate hope that Alice was telling truth and cynical certainty that she was lying to prevent his suicide, and that Bella was actually dead, regardless of what Alice claimed. He demanded proof, and Alice provided details she could only know through her visions or through direct contact with Bella. Descriptions of Bella's current location and emotional state, and the confusion about why Edward had not called or returned to Forks after learning about the cliff diving incident. Her specificity and her genuine panic finally penetrating Edward's numbness and making him accept that perhaps Bella was actually alive and that Rosalie's interpretation of Alice's vision had been wrong. But even as relief began flooding through him, Edward heard the clock tower beginning to chime noon, understood that he was out of time to reconsider his plan, recognized that stopping now would mean explaining to the Volturi why he had come to Volterra during their festival and what he had been planning, potentially creating complications and exposures that would be dangerous for reasons having nothing to do with his own survival. He made decision in the fraction of a second between Alice's continued pleas and the final chime of the clock, his body tensing to step into the sunlight despite Alice's revelation, because confusion and momentum and sheer inability to reverse course quickly enough made following through with his original plan seem simpler than attempting to abort and retreat. He moved toward the light streaming into the plaza from the break between buildings, his skin already beginning to sparkle as sunlight touched his hand, the tourists nearby starting to notice the strange glittering effect, even though their minds had not yet processed what they were seeing or formulated explanations for the impossible phenomenon. And then he heard her voice screaming his name, Bella's distinctive tone cutting through the festival noise and the crowd's chatter and his own chaotic thoughts. Her presence impossible but undeniable as she crashed into him and pushed him back into shadow before he could complete his step into full exposure. Edward's hands came up automatically to catch her and steady her, his mind struggling to reconcile her physical presence with his certainty mere minutes ago that she was dead, his vampire senses confirming that she was real and solid and alive, and breathing hard from running through the crowds to reach him before he destroyed himself. He touched her face with shaking hands, his fingers tracing her features to confirm she was not hallucination or vision or ghost come to torment him. Her skin warm and her pulse rapid under his cold palm, her eyes showing concern and confusion and love in equal measure as she demanded to know what he had been thinking and why he had come to Italy and what exactly he had been planning to do in that plaza. Edward could not form coherent response, his thoughts still catching up to the reality that Bella was alive and he was not going to die, and everything he had believed about her suicide had been catastrophic misunderstanding based on incomplete information and Rosalie's eagerness to deliver bad news. The Volturi guard appeared within seconds, Jane and Felix and Dimitri materializing from the crowd with speed that suggested they had been watching Edward and waiting to intervene if he actually exposed himself. Their presence confirming that the Volturi were aware of his presence in Volterra during the festival and had been monitoring his intentions and his movements. Jane's thoughts were cold and analytical. Her assessment of the situation focused on determining whether Edward had actually violated their laws or simply intended to. Her disappointment evident when she realized that Bella's intervention had prevented the exposure that would have justified immediate execution. Felix's thoughts were eager and violent, his desire to fight and destroy making him hope that Edward would resist, or that Jane would order the execution regardless of whether actual law had been broken. His bloodlust barely contained beneath the professional demeanor required when acting as Volturi guard. Dimitri's thoughts were more measured and curious, his tracking gift making him interested in how Alice had managed to arrive in Volterra so quickly, and how she had known Edward needed intervention. His assessment that the Cullen family's gifts were remarkable and potentially valuable to the Volturi, making him view this situation as recruitment opportunity rather than simple law enforcement. Jane invited them underground with politeness that was clearly command rather than request, her thoughts revealing that refusing would be interpreted as challenge to Volturi authority and would justify the violence that Felix was hoping for. Her certainty that Aro would want to meet Edward and examine the situation personally, making the summons inevitable regardless of Edward's preferences or his desire to simply leave Volterra with Bella and never return. Edward read Alice's thoughts as his sister joined them, her visions showing multiple possible futures branching from this moment, some ending in their destruction and some ending in their release, but all requiring them to face Aro and submit to his judgment about whether they had violated laws or simply contemplated violations that had been prevented by timely intervention. The throne room beneath Volterra was exactly as Edward remembered from his single previous visit decades earlier, when Carlyle had brought him to meet the ancient vampires who had been Carlyle's companions during his early centuries as vampire. The massive chamber decorated with priceless Renaissance art and illuminated by torches that created medieval atmosphere appropriate for vampires who predated most modern nations and institutions. Aro sat in the central throne with Marcus and Caius flanking him, the three ancient vampires presenting united front of absolute authority and power that had maintained order among vampire kind for nearly 3,000 years through combination of strategic violence and careful political management. Aro's thoughts were delighted and fascinated as Edward and Bella and Alice were brought before the thrones, his particular interest in Edward's telepathic gift, evident in his immediate request to touch Edward's hand and read his thoughts directly through his own gift of tactile telepathy that allowed him to absorb every thought and memory from anyone he touched. Edward extended his hand reluctantly, knowing that resistance would be interpreted as insult, and that Aro's curiosity about the situation was probably their best chance for surviving this encounter without being destroyed, for knowing too much, or being too interesting, or simply being inconvenient to the Volturi's carefully maintained order. Aro's mind flooded Edward's consciousness as their hands connected. the ancient vampire's thoughts vast and complex, and filled with millennia of memories and experiences that made Edward's 9 decades seem insignificant and brief. His assessment of Edward's gift and Edward's recent experiences running in parallel streams as he absorbed information about Bella and the situation in Volterra and Edward's suicidal intentions. Aro was particularly fascinated by Edward's description of Bella's mind being silent to his telepathy, his curiosity about this immunity making him immediately want to test whether she was also immune to his own gift. His political calculations running simultaneously as he considered whether Edward and Alice would be valuable additions to his guard and whether Bella represented threat or simply interesting anomaly. Aro released Edward's hand and turned his attention to Bella with a smile that did not reach his eyes. His request to touch her hand and read her thoughts delivered with courtesy that barely masked the command beneath, his expectation being that she would comply immediately and without question, because refusing Aro was not done by anyone who wanted to continue existing. Bella extended her hand with visible nervousness, her pulse accelerating and her scent intensifying in ways that made Edward tense and protective, despite knowing that attacking Aro would result in their immediate destruction by the guard members positioned around the room. Aro's expression shifted from confident expectation to shocked confusion as he touched Bella's hand and found only silence where her thoughts should be. His gift failing for apparently the first time in 3,000 years, his mind showing Edward that he had never encountered anyone immune to his tactile telepathy, and that Bella's resistance was unprecedented and fascinating and potentially threatening, depending on whether this immunity extended to other vampire gifts beyond mental intrusion. Aro tested her repeatedly, his grip on her hand tightening as he concentrated and pushed his gift harder, trying to penetrate whatever shield was blocking his access, his frustration growing as he continued to fail despite his certainty that his power should work on everyone, regardless of their mental defenses or unusual neurology. Jane stepped forward at Aro's subtle signal, her thoughts eager and cruel, as she prepared to test whether Bella's immunity extended to her own gift of pain illusion, that she could project into the minds of her victims and make them experience agony without any physical cause or injury. Edward moved to intercept, but Felix grabbed him and held him immobile while Jane focused her gift on Bella. The small vampire's thoughts showing absolute confidence that her power would work and that Bella would collapse screaming within seconds of Jane's attention, focusing on her consciousness. But Bella stood untouched and unaffected, Jane's gift sliding off whatever mental shield protected her exactly the way Aro's and Edward's telepathy had failed to penetrate. The immunity complete and apparently extending to all mental intrusion regardless of its nature or intended effect. Aro's fascination intensified into something approaching obsession as he observed Jane's failure, his thoughts revealing that he wanted Bella for his collection of gifted vampires, that her immunity would make her invaluable as guard member who could resist mental attacks from enemies, that transforming her immediately and recruiting her to the Volturi would be ideal outcome from his perspective. But he also recognized that forcing Edward's cooperation would be difficult, given Edward's obvious devotion to Bella and his family connections to Carlisle, who Aro respected and valued despite their philosophical differences about vampire existence and interaction with humans. The negotiation that followed was delicate and tense. Aro proposing that Bella be transformed immediately and join the Volturi Guard, while Edward and Alice were free to return to their family. His thoughts revealing that he expected Edward to refuse this arrangement, and that the refusal would give Aro justification for keeping all three of them in Volterra permanently. Edward read this trap clearly in Aro's mind and understood that any response except complete agreement would be interpreted as challenge. But before he could formulate strategy, Alice stepped forward and offered her hand to Aro, her thoughts broadcasting vision she had prepared specifically for this moment, showing Bella's transformation happening in the future with the Cullens present, and Bella emerging as a vampire with eyes golden from animal blood rather than red from human feeding. Aro took Alice's hand eagerly and absorbed her vision, his thoughts showing him future Bella as vampire standing beside Edward, with the Cullen family surrounding them. The image clear enough and specific enough to convince him the transformation was genuinely planned and would actually occur, rather than being empty promise designed to escape Volterra without consequences. Aro's political calculations ran rapidly as he weighed the value of Bella's current immunity against the certainty that she would be transformed eventually, and that forcing the issue now would create permanent enmity with Carlisle's coven, whose gifts and abilities made them potentially valuable allies or dangerous enemies, depending on how this situation resolved. The decision took less than a minute, Aro's thoughts settling on allowing them to leave, with understanding that the Volturi would be watching and would expect Bella's transformation to occur within reasonable time frame. His warning that failure to transform her would result in the Volturi coming to enforce their decree, delivered with a friendly smile that made the threat even more chilling than direct violence would have been. He dismissed them with elaborate courtesy and reminders that the Volturi valued their relationship with Carlisle and hoped to see Edward and Alice again under more pleasant circumstances. His thoughts revealing that he genuinely meant the invitation and that he would continue working to recruit them away from Carlisle's coven through persuasion or pressure applied over decades or centuries until he eventually succeeded, or they were destroyed by someone else. The escape from Volterra happened quickly, Alice leading them through underground passages and then through the city streets to where she had left a stolen car, her visions guiding them away from guards and toward the fastest route out of the city and away from Volturi territory. Edward held Bella's hand throughout the journey, his mind still struggling to fully integrate the reality that she was alive, and he had not lost her, and his suicidal mission to Volterra had been based on catastrophic misunderstanding rather than actual tragedy. He read Alice's thoughts and found anger mixed with relief, her fury at Rosalie for delivering incomplete information, and at Edward for not verifying Bella's death before attempting suicide, warring with her joy that everyone had survived and that they were returning to something resembling normal existence rather than being destroyed or recruited by the Volturi. Bella's questions about why Edward had come to Volterra and what he had been planning required answers he was not ready to give. His shame at having believed Rosalie's news without verification mixing with his continued conviction that leaving Bella had been right decision, even if the execution had been catastrophically flawed. He told her eventually about Rosalie's call and Alice's vision and his certainty that a world without her was not worth existing in. his confession of his suicidal intentions delivered in flat, emotionless voice that did not convey the depth of his despair during the flight to Italy, or the relief he felt now that she was alive and real and sitting beside him in Alice's stolen car, speeding away from Volterra and toward whatever future they could build together. The return to Forks in late March was complicated by realities Edward had tried to escape through his departure and his months of self-imposed exile. His reunion with Bella, creating immediate joy that was almost instantly tempered by recognition that none of the actual dangers or complications had been resolved by his leaving, and that Victoria remained threat, requiring attention and strategy beyond simple avoidance or hopeful assumption that the tracker had abandoned her revenge quest. Edward read Charlie's thoughts during his first visit to the Swan house, after returning, and found the police chief's mind filled with confusion and protective anger. His relief that Bella seemed happier warring with his suspicion that Edward's departure and sudden return suggested instability or manipulation that Charlie could not quite identify, but that made him deeply uneasy about his daughter's relationship with Boy, who seemed capable of destroying her emotional well-being through simple absence. Alice's visions began showing the newborn army in early April, her precognitive gift revealing fragments of Victoria's plan to create force of young vampires whose strength and numbers would overwhelm the Cullen's experience and coordination. The tracker's strategy being to use the newborns as blunt instrument, while she herself hung back and waited for opportunity to reach Bella during the chaos of battle. Edward read Alice's thoughts as she described her visions to the family and saw the futures branching and shifting based on decisions that had not yet been made. The army's size varying between 15 and 30 newborns, depending on how successful Victoria was in her creation efforts and how many of the young vampires survived their volatile first year without being destroyed by each other or by the Volturi, who monitored newborn creation carefully to prevent exactly the kind of army Victoria was assembling. The decision to involve the Quileute pack came reluctantly after Alice's visions showed clearly that 7 Cullens would not be sufficient to defeat an army of 20 or more newborns without sustaining casualties that Edward could not accept, and that Carlyle recognized as unacceptable risk to family he'd spent centuries building and protecting. Edward had avoided the reservation and the wolves since his return. His awareness that the shapeshifters could read each other's thoughts while in wolf form, making him wary of proximity to minds he could not read and could not control through his usual methods of monitoring intentions and predicting behaviors. But necessity overrode preference, and Carlyle arranged meeting with Sam Yulee on the treaty line to discuss alliance against common threat that endangered both the Cullens and the humans living on the reservation. Edward read Sam's thoughts during the negotiation and found the pack leader's mind disciplined and strategic, his assessment of the situation pragmatic despite his personal distaste for vampires, and his awareness that alliance would require his pack to fight alongside creatures they were genetically programmed to destroy. Sam's thoughts revealed that Jacob Black had been transformed into shapeshifter during Edward's absence. The shock of vampire presence in Forks triggering the dormant gene that turned Quileute descendants into massive wolves, capable of fighting vampires on relatively equal terms despite lacking vampire speed and strength. Edward read Sam's assessment of Jacob's capabilities and found respect mixed with concern. The younger wolf being powerful but inexperienced and emotionally volatile in ways that made him potentially liability despite his obvious talent and dedication. Jacob's thoughts were accessible to Edward only during the training sessions, when the pack maintained human form and met with the Cullens to learn Jasper's strategies for fighting newborns. The young wolf's mind filled with love for Bella and resentment toward Edward and determination to protect her, regardless of what alliance with vampires required of him personally. Edward found Jacob's devotion to Bella simultaneously touching and threatening. His recognition that the wolf could offer her warmth and humanity a normal future, creating jealousy that Edward tried to suppress but could not entirely eliminate despite knowing his own possessiveness, was irrational and selfish. He read Jacob's fantasies about Bella choosing him instead of Edward and found them painful, but also strangely understandable. The wolf's certainty that Bella would be happier with Shapeshifter, who could age alongside her and give her children and normal human experiences, making arguments that Edward himself had used when trying to convince Bella to delay transformation. Jasper's training sessions were tense and educational, his thoughts revealing experiences from the Southern Vampire Wars that shocked even Edward, who had believed himself familiar with vampire violence and capability for cruelty. Jasper's memories of Maria and the newborn armies she had created and destroyed in endless cycles of creation and culling made Victoria's current army seem almost modest by comparison. His descriptions of battles involving hundreds of newborns fighting over territory and feeding grounds, painting a picture of vampire existence that was far darker and more brutal than anything the Cullens had experienced in their peaceful nomadic existence. Edward read Jasper's techniques for fighting newborns in his brother's thoughts and saw the cold, tactical thinking that had kept Jasper alive through decades of warfare. His ability to manipulate emotions making him a devastating opponent who could amplify his enemy's fear while suppressing their aggression and make them vulnerable to attacks they should have been able to defend against. The pack learned quickly, despite their inexperience, their natural coordination and their ability to share thoughts while shifted, giving them advantages that compensated somewhat for their lack of formal training or combat experience against supernatural opponents. Edward watched the wolves work together during practice sessions and saw their potential despite their youth, their pack mentality allowing them to execute complex strategies with minimal verbal communication, and their size and strength making them genuinely dangerous to vampires who underestimated them or failed to account for their coordinated attacks and their willingness to sacrifice individual safety for collective victory. Alice's visions of the battle showed it happening in a clearing in the mountains north of Forks. The location isolated enough that human witnesses would be unlikely but accessible enough that Victoria's army could reach it, following the scent trail Alice planned to lay leading away from Bella's actual location. Edward's role in Alice's visions was consistently to guard Bella away from the battle, his presence with her being necessary to prevent Victoria from simply bypassing the army and the defenders and reaching Bella directly, while everyone else was occupied with the newborns. Edward read Alice's certainty in her thoughts and accepted the plan despite his desire to fight alongside his family. His recognition that protecting Bella was more important than participating in battle overriding his pride and his wish to contribute to the defense more actively. The The tent on the mountain became prison and torture chamber simultaneously during the night before the battle. Edward forced into proximity with Jacob Black, while both of them kept Bella alive through a freezing night that her human body could not survive without external heat source. Edward read Jacob's thoughts throughout the terrible hours and experienced the wolf's fantasies about Bella choosing him. His satisfaction at being able to provide warmth Edward could not offer. His hope that this night would demonstrate to Bella that Edward was fundamentally wrong choice, and that Jacob represented better future than immortality with cold vampire who could never give her children or normal human life. Edward's humiliation at being unable to provide what Bella needed in that moment was profound and complete. His cold vampire body useless except as additional barrier between Bella and the tent walls that did nothing to block the wind howling outside. His jealousy of Jacob's warmth and his utility creating resentment. Edward tried to suppress through rational acknowledgement that Jacob was saving Bella's life, and that personal feelings were less important than her survival. He listened to Jacob's thoughts and heard the wolf's certainty that Edward was wrong for Bella. His arguments that transformation would steal her humanity and her chance at normal existence. His judgment that Edward's love was selfish possession rather than genuine care for Bella's well-being and future happiness. The battle in the clearing happened exactly as Alice had foreseen. The Cullens and the wolves destroying Victoria's newborn army through superior coordination and Jasper's tactical expertise, the young vampire's strength and aggression no match for experienced fighters working together with clear strategy and mutual trust. Edward monitored the battle through Alice's thoughts as she shared her visions with him telepathically, his relief growing as he saw his family surviving and the newborns being systematically eliminated despite their numbers and their fierce determination to overwhelm the defenders through sheer violent persistence. Victoria and Riley approached the tent as Edward had anticipated, the tracker's strategy being to use her mate as distraction while she herself circled around to attack from unexpected angle. Her thoughts, when Edward finally read them, showing obsessive focus on revenge that had consumed her completely since James's death, and made her existence entirely about causing Edward equivalent pain through killing Bella. Edward fought alongside Seth Clearwater, the young wolf's enthusiasm and natural talent making him effective partner despite his inexperience and his tendency toward recklessness that would have been dangerous if Edward had not been reading his thoughts and coordinating their attacks to compensate for Seth's youthful overconfidence. Edward destroyed Riley with efficiency born from necessity rather than enjoyment, his reading of the young vampire's thoughts revealing that Riley genuinely believed Victoria loved him and had no awareness that she was using him as expendable pawn in a revenge scheme. Edward felt Bree pity for Riley before tearing him apart. The recognition that Victoria had manipulated and lied to her supposed mate, making Riley's devotion tragic rather than simply pathetic. Victoria's destruction followed quickly, Edward and Seth working together to corner the tracker and eliminate the threat she had represented since James's death nearly a year earlier. Her final thoughts showing surprise that Edward had proven capable of violence she had not believed civilized Cullen could execute, her last awareness being recognition that her revenge quest had failed and that James would remain unavenged. The Volturi's arrival after the battle ended was anticipated but still tense. Jane leading a contingent to investigate the illegal newborn army and determine whether the Cullens had been involved in its creation or simply defending themselves from Victoria's attack. Edward read Jane's thoughts and found disappointment that she had no legitimate reason to punish the Cullens. Her desire to hurt them and demonstrate Volturi's superiority frustrated by the clear evidence that Victoria had created the army, and that the Cullens and their wolf allies had simply destroyed threat to human population that the Volturi themselves should have detected and eliminated before it grew to dangerous size. Jane's execution of Britannia, despite the Cullens' pleas for mercy, demonstrated the Volturi's absolute authority and their interpretation of law as whatever served their political interests, rather than abstract justice. The young vampire's surrender and her cooperation meaning nothing to Jane, who saw her merely as loose end requiring elimination, regardless of her potential innocence or her lack of genuine understanding about what she had been created for and what law she was violating simply by existing. Edward read Bree's terrified thoughts as Jane destroyed her, and felt rage at the injustice mixed with helpless recognition that challenging the Volturi's decision would only result in more deaths and no actual change in outcome. The proposal happened weeks after the battle, when life had returned to something approaching normal, and Edward had time to plan properly the formal request he wanted to make. Despite Bella's continued insistence that marriage was unnecessary complication rather than meaningful prerequisite to transformation, Edward read Bella's resistance to marriage in her expressions and her arguments, even though he could not read her actual thoughts. His understanding that her parents' divorce had soured her on the institution, warring with his own deeply held conviction that proper sequence was engagement, then marriage, then physical intimacy, then transformation, regardless of how outdated Bella found his values or how little she cared about traditional milestones. He proposed with his mother Elizabeth's ring in the meadow, where he had first revealed himself to Bella in full sunlight. His formal speech prepared carefully to address her concerns while still making clear that this condition was non-negotiable if she wanted his cooperation with her transformation plans. Edward read her acceptance in her face before she spoke the words, her love for him overcoming her resistance to marriage as institution, her willingness to accommodate his old-fashioned requirements, creating compromise that allowed them both to feel they had achieved what mattered most, even if the path to that achievement required concessions neither had initially wanted to make. Alice began planning the wedding immediately with enthusiasm that overwhelmed Bella's attempts to keep the ceremony small and private. Her visions of the perfect celebration driving her preparations despite Bella's protests. That elaborate party was exactly what she did not want for an event she had agreed to, primarily to satisfy Edward's values rather than her own desires. Edward read Alice's joy in her thoughts and decided not to interfere with his sister's planning. His recognition that Alice needed this project and that the wedding would be beautiful regardless of Bella's current reservations, making him confident that Bella would eventually appreciate the effort, even if she could not currently imagine enjoying being center of attention for elaborate formal ceremony. The summer passed in contentment that felt fragile and precious. Edward's awareness that their human time together was limited, making every moment feel significant and worth savoring. his plans for their honeymoon at Isle Esme creating anticipation mixed with terror about maintaining control during physical intimacy that would test his restraint in ways that sitting beside Bella in biology class had tested him during their first meeting. He read his own thoughts and recognized that his fear of hurting her was legitimate but potentially overblown. His trust in Carlisle's assurances that control was possible, warring with his knowledge of his own strength and his capacity for losing awareness of physical reality when overwhelmed by emotion or sensation. Jacob's appearance at the wedding reception created final confrontation that Edward had been dreading. The wolf's thoughts filled with love for Bella and rage at Edward for taking her away from humanity and toward transformation that Jacob viewed as death rather than simply change. Edward read Jacob's mind as he learned about the honeymoon plans and saw the wolf's horror transform into fury at the danger Edward would be creating by attempting physical intimacy with Bella while she remained human and fragile. His protective instinct demanding he prevent what he viewed as Edward's reckless selfishness, regardless of what Bella herself wanted or had consented to freely. Sam and the pack had to physically restrain Jacob to prevent him from phasing and attacking Edward in front of all the wedding guests. The young wolf's control shattered by his terror for Bella's safety and his inability to accept that she had made informed choice to proceed with plans that included physical relationship before transformation. Edward read Jacob's anguish and found it genuine and painful despite their rivalry. His recognition that Jacob's love for Bella was real even if it was also possessive and controlling in ways Jacob refused to acknowledge, making the confrontation tragic rather than simply antagonistic. The departure for Isle Esme happened with rice and celebration, and Bella's tearful goodbye to Charlie, who clearly believed he was losing his daughter permanently, even though he had no context for understanding the literal truth of that assessment. Edward drove them to the airport reading Bella's mixture of excitement and nervousness, her anticipation of their honeymoon evident, despite her careful control of her expression, his own terror and desire creating internal conflict. He tried to hide behind calm exterior that probably fooled no one who knew him well enough to read his body language, even without access to his thoughts. And so Edward Cullen's century of isolation ended where it had truly begun, with a girl whose mind he could never read and whose blood sang to him more powerfully than anything he had encountered in 90 years of existence as predator pretending to be civilized. The monster who had believed himself beyond redemption, discovering that love was possible even for creatures who had surrendered their humanity and their souls in exchange for immortality and eternal hunger. He had lived through the Spanish influenza pandemic that killed his human body, and through Carlisle's venom that rebuilt him into something that would never age or sicken or die, had survived his rebellious decade hunting criminals and convincing himself that selective murder was somehow noble, had endured centuries of watching his family find love, while he remained alone and certain that his particular darkness made him unworthy of connection or partnership. He had believed he understood loneliness and isolation, had convinced himself that his existence was acceptable and perhaps even preferable to the complications that came with caring about someone who could be lost or damaged or destroyed by proximity to vampire world. But Bella Swan had shattered every certainty he had constructed about his nature and his capacity for feeling things beyond carefully controlled emotions. he permitted himself during his endless performance of humanity. She had walked into his biology class and transformed his careful numbness into obsession that consumed him completely, had accepted his monstrous nature with faith that terrified him, because it suggested she saw goodness in him that he could not locate in himself, despite decades of searching for evidence that he was more than predator wearing civilized mask. She had chosen him despite every rational argument suggesting she should run from vampire who wanted her blood more than he wanted anything else in his long existence, had trusted him despite his warnings that being near him meant courting death through simple mathematics of fragile human spending time with creature designed specifically to hunt and kill humans. Edward's truth had been darker and more obsessive and more desperate than Bella ever fully knew. His surveillance of her sleeping form and his monitoring of her life through reading the thoughts of everyone around her, revealing possessiveness that would have been concerning in human boyfriend, but that was genuinely dangerous in vampire who could kill her accidentally through momentary loss of control or deliberate choice to satisfy thirst that burned constantly in his throat whenever she was near. He had broken into her room and watched her dream and convinced himself this invasion was protection rather than violation, had read Charlie's thoughts and Jessica's thoughts and Mike's thoughts to understand Bella better because her own mind remained frustratingly and fascinatingly silent to his telepathic gift. He had left her believing that separation would protect her from dangers he represented, had delivered carefully constructed lies designed to make her hate him because he believed her hatred was safer than her love, had spent months in self-imposed exile tracking Victoria and convincing himself that staying away was noble sacrifice rather than simple cowardice dressed up as selflessness. He had planned his own death in Volterra when he believed Bella had died. His conviction that world without her was not worth existing in revealing the depth of his transformation from isolated, immortal to vampire whose entire existence had become centered on one human girl, whose survival mattered more than his own continuation. The weight of his choices and his mistakes and his obsessive devotion to girl he could never fully know, because her thoughts remained inaccessible, would have crushed someone with less experience carrying guilt and self-loathing. But Edward had been practicing self-recrimination for 90 years and knew how to function despite believing himself fundamentally flawed and unworthy of the love Bella offered with such casual certainty. He had accepted her faith in his goodness even though he could not share it, had allowed himself happiness he had never expected to experience, had chosen to believe that perhaps monsters could be redeemed through love even when redemption seemed impossible and undeserved. His human life had ended in a Chicago hospital in 1918, with his mother Elizabeth begging Carlyle to save her son by any means necessary. His transformation into vampire completing 3 days later, when he woke to heightened senses and supernatural abilities and hunger that would define his existence for the next 9 decades. But his vampire life had only truly begun in a Forks High School biology classroom in 2005, when Bella Swan sat down beside him, and her silent mind and her appealing blood forced him to choose between the monster he feared he was and the person he desperately wanted to become. He stood now at the threshold of forever, with Bella choosing him, despite all evidence suggesting she should choose normal human life with someone like Jacob Black, who could offer her warmth and aging and children and everything Edward's cold, immortal body could never provide. She had accepted transformation and eternity with him, had agreed to marriage and honeymoon, and the permanent surrender of her humanity in exchange for partnership with vampire who loved her with intensity that frightened him, because it revealed how completely she had unmade and remade him simply by existing and by refusing to fear what he was or what he was capable of becoming. The century of loneliness had been preparation for this moment. Edward's isolation and his suffering creating space for Bella to enter and transform everything he thought he understood about love and choice, and the possibility that immortal existence might contain meaning beyond simple continuation and careful control of base instincts. His truth had been hidden behind bronze hair and golden eyes and perfect performance of humanity. The desperate obsession masked as protective love, the darkness that had consumed him long before Bella arrived, and that her presence had illuminated rather than eliminated. So rest now, gentle dreamers, with Edward standing beside Bella at the beginning of their forever, his human life a century gone, and his vampire life finally acquiring purpose beyond simple endurance. The monster who believed himself damned, discovering that perhaps redemption was possible even for creatures who had no right to hope for it. The silent-minded girl and the telepathic vampire choosing each other despite every obstacle and every danger and every rational argument suggesting their love was impossible and unsustainable and doomed to end in tragedy. Their story was just beginning, but Edward's transformation was complete. The isolated vampire who had spent 90 years alone finally understanding that eternity might be bearable if spent with someone who saw past his monstrous nature to the person he was trying desperately to become. The girl whose thoughts he could never read teaching him that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, and that love required faith rather than perfect knowledge or absolute certainty about futures that remained unknowable regardless of Alice's visions or Edward's careful planning.